Beneath the waves of our world's oceans lie secrets that have captivated humanity for millennia, stories of advanced civilizations that vanished, of magnificent cities swallowed by the sea of catastrophes that reshape the very face of our planet. Tonight we embark on a journey to explore these lost worlds, examining both the legends that have endured for thousands of years and the scientific evidence that is only now coming to light. From Plato's Atlantis to the drowned plains of Doggerland, from the mysterious structures off the coast of Japan to the real cities discovered beneath Mediterranean waters, the story of lost civilizations is far more complex than simple myth or fantasy. It's a story grounded in geological fact, archaeological discovery, and the very real catastrophes that have repeatedly transformed our planet. Between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, claiming millions of square kilometers of inhabited land. Entire landscapes where our ancestors lived, worked, and built, their communities now lie beneath the ocean. Their stories preserved only in sediment, stone, and perhaps in the flood legends that appear in cultures across the globe. Over the next 3 hours, we'll explore this hidden history with the careful attention it deserves. We'll examine the evidence that archaeologists and geologists have gathered, consider the theories that scholars have proposed, and distinguish between what we can demonstrate and what remains speculation. This is a journey built on research and scientific investigation, drawing on the work of experts who have dedicated their careers to understanding our planet's past. But it's also a human story about the resilience of our ancestors, the power of cultural memory, and our enduring fascination with what has been lost. We'll move thoughtfully through this material, taking time to understand the complexity of each discovery and debate. This isn't a race through facts, but a careful exploration designed for nighttime listening, informative, enough to engage your curiosity, but paced to allow your mind to wander and rest. Our exploration unfolds in several movements. We'll begin with the legends themselves: Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu, and Shambhala, examining their origins and what they reveal about human imagination and the search for lost wisdom. Then we'll turn to the real lost lands that science has confirmed: Doggerland in the North Sea, Sundaland in Southeast Asia, and the coastal settlements now submerged around the world. We'll investigate specific sites that challenge our understanding, from Göbekli Tepe, which rewrote the history of civilization, to Madol, the stone city built on artificial islands in the Pacific. We'll explore how modern technology is revolutionizing underwater archaeology, revealing secrets that have been hidden for millennia. And we'll consider the great catastrophes: the younger Dryas event, volcanic eruptions, and the relentless rise of the seas that shaped human history in ways we're only beginning to understand. Throughout this journey, we'll maintain a balance between wonder and skepticism, between the allure of mystery and the discipline of evidence. Some of what we'll explore is firmly established by science. Other aspects remain debated with reasonable scholars, reaching different conclusions. And some questions may never be fully answered. The ocean keeps its secrets well. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this journey together into the depths of the ocean, into the distant past, and into the enduring mystery of the civilizations that time and tide have claimed. Cities sunken legends. There are stories that refuse to die. Across every continent and languages, both ancient and modern human beings have told tales of magnificent cities that vanished beneath the waves. These are not simple flood stories or cautionary tales about divine punishment. They are detailed accounts, specific in their geography, precise in their descriptions of architecture, and consistent in their references to sudden catastrophe. For thousands of years, scholars dismissed these stories as mythology, as the imaginative products of prescientific minds trying to make sense of natural disasters. But in recent decades, something remarkable has happened. We've begun to find them. The discovery didn't happen all at once. It emerged gradually through a combination of advancing technology, patient archaeology and a willingness to take ancient texts more seriously than previous generations had. What we're learning is that the boundary between myth and history is far thinner than we once believed. The ocean floor, it turns out, is not just a graveyard for shipwrecks. It's a museum of human civilization, preserving entire chapters of our story that were thought to be lost forever. Consider the ancient Greek city of Helike. For more than 2,000 years, it existed only in historical accounts. Writers like Pausanias described it as a prosperous city on the Gulf of Corinth, home to a famous temple of Poseidon. Then on a winter night in 373 BCE, an earthquake struck. The ground liquefied beneath the city, and within hours Helike had disappeared. Ancient sources reported that the city sank into the earth and was covered by the sea. For centuries, historians debated whether Helike had ever existed at all. Some suggested it was a morality tale, a Greek version of Sodom and Gomorrah. Others believed the accounts but assumed any remains would be impossible to locate after so much time. Then in 2001, a team led by archaeologists Dora Katsonopoulou and Stephen Soter made an extraordinary discovery. Using ground-penetrating radar and systematic excavation, they found Helike not underwater, as the ancient texts suggested, but buried under meters of sediment in a coastal lagoon. The earthquake had indeed caused the ground to liquefy, and the city had sunk. But over the centuries, the coastline had shifted, and sediment from nearby rivers had covered the site. What they uncovered was astonishing streets, laid out in a grid pattern, building foundations, pottery coins, and even the remains of the temple of Poseidon. Helike was real. The ancient accounts dismissed as legend had been accurate all along. But Helike is not unique. Off the southern coast of Greece, near the village of Pavlopetri, lies another drowned city, this one truly underwater. Discovered in 1967 by oceanographer Nicholas Fleming, Pavlopetri dates back approximately 5,000 years, making it one of the oldest submerged cities ever found. The site covers about 50,000 square meters of seafloor at depths of 3 to 4 meters. What makes Pavlopetri extraordinary is its state of preservation. You can still see the street plan, the outlines of buildings, courtyards, and what appear to be graves. In 2009, a team from the University of Nottingham conducted a detailed survey using sophisticated sonar equipment. They created a three-dimensional reconstruction of the ancient city, revealing a complex urban settlement with a sophisticated layout. This wasn't a small fishing village. This was a significant Bronze Age town, complete with a system of roads and multi-room buildings. The existence of places like Helike and Pavlopetri forces us to reconsider what we thought we knew about ancient myths. If these cities are real, what about the others? What about the grander, more ambitious stories, the tales of entire civilizations that vanished beneath the waves? This question has driven a new generation of researchers to look more carefully at the ocean floor. They're using technology that would have seemed like science fiction just a few decades ago. Multibeam sonar can map the seafloor with extraordinary precision, revealing features that would be invisible to divers. Side-scan sonar can detect anomalies, unusual shapes, or patterns that might indicate human construction. Remotely operated vehicles equipped with high-definition cameras can explore depths that would be fatal to human divers. Satellite imagery can detect subtle variations in water color and temperature that might indicate structures beneath the surface. What these technologies have revealed is sobering. The ocean floor is not a flat, featureless plain. It's a landscape as varied as any on land, with mountains, valleys, plains, and canyons. And increasingly we're finding evidence that humans once lived on parts of this landscape when it was above water. The reason is simple: sea levels have changed dramatically over the course of human history. 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, So much water was locked up in ice sheets that global sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. This meant that vast areas that are now underwater were then dry land. The English Channel was a river valley. The Persian Gulf was a fertile plain. Indonesia, Malaysia, and parts of the Philippines were connected by a landmass the size of India. These weren't marginal, inhospitable regions. They were often the most attractive places for human settlement. Coastal plains, with access to both marine and terrestrial resources, river valleys, with fertile soil areas with moderate climates. Then, as the Ice Age ended and the glaciers melted, the seas began to rise. This didn't happen overnight. It was a process that unfolded over thousands of years. But from the perspective of the people living through it, the change would have been relentless and devastating. Coastlines that had been stable for generations would gradually move inland. Villages would be abandoned. Fishing grounds would be submerged. Entire landscapes would disappear beneath the advancing waters. For coastal communities, this would have been an apocalypse in slow motion. A catastrophe that played out not over days or weeks, but over centuries and millennia. Is it any wonder then that stories of great floods appear in so many cultures? That tales of lost lands and drowned cities persist across the world? These might not be fantasies or moral parables. They might be cultural memories, stories passed down through countless generations, preserving the knowledge that the world was once different, that there were lands where now there is only ocean. The challenge for modern archaeology is to separate genuine historical memory from later embellishment and pure invention. Not every story of a lost city is based on a real place, but some of them are. The question is which ones and how do we find them? This is where the work becomes both scientific and interpretive. Researchers must combine multiple lines of evidence, ancient texts and oral traditions, geological data about past sea levels and coastlines, archaeological surveys of the seafloor, and careful analysis of any structures or artifacts that are discovered. It's painstaking work often conducted in difficult conditions, and it requires patience, funding, and a willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it challenges established narratives about the past. What's emerging from this research is a more complex picture of human history. We're learning that civilization is older than we thought, more widespread than we imagined, and more vulnerable to environmental change than we'd like to believe. The cities beneath the waves are not just archaeological curiosities. They're warnings and lessons. They remind us that the landscapes we take for granted are temporary, that the coastlines we build our cities on are not permanent, and that human societies have risen and fallen many times before our own. As we continue to explore the ocean floor, we're likely to find more lost cities, more evidence of ancient civilizations that thrived and then disappeared. Each discovery will add another piece to the puzzle of human history, and each will raise new questions about what else might be waiting to be found in the depths. The stories our ancestors told about drowned cities and lost lands were not just fantasies. They were memories preserved in the only way available to pre-literate societies through story and song passed from generation to generation. Now, with our modern technology, we're finally able to verify what they tried to tell us. The cities are real. The lost lands existed. And beneath the waves, much of that world still remains, waiting to reveal its secrets to those patient enough to search for them. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore some of the most famous and controversial of these lost civilizations, from Plato's Atlantis to the sunken lands of the Pacific, from ancient temples beneath the Indian Ocean to the drowned landscapes of the North Sea. We'll examine the evidence, consider the theories, and try to separate fact from fiction. But we begin with this fundamental understanding: the ocean holds our history, and we're only just beginning to read it. Plato and the story of the first Atlantis. Among all the stories of lost civilizations, one name stands above the rest. It's a name that has inspired countless expeditions, generated libraries of speculation, and captured imaginations for more than 2 millennia. That name is Atlantis. But where did this story actually come from? The answer takes us back to ancient Athens, to a philosopher whose influence on Western thought can hardly be overstated. Around 360 BCE, Plato, already in his 60s, and one of the most respected thinkers in the Greek world, wrote 2 dialogues that would echo through history in ways he likely never anticipated. These works, titled Timaeus and Critias, contain the only ancient written account of Atlantis that survives today. Everything else, every theory, every search, every claim about this lost civilization, traces back to these 2 texts. Plato's account is presented not as his own invention, but as a story passed down through generations. According to the dialogues, the tale originates with Solon, one of Athens' most revered lawgivers, who lived about 2 centuries before Plato. Solon, the story goes, traveled to Egypt around 590 BCE and visited the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. There he conversed with priests who had access to records far more ancient than anything preserved in Greece. These priests, Plato tells us, shared with Solon an account of a great island civilization that had existed 9,000 years before their own time, which would place Atlantis around 9,600 BCE, deep in prehistory. The priests described Atlantis as lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. The island itself, according to Plato's account, was larger than Libya and Asia combined, though scholars debate what exactly these geographical terms meant in ancient Greek understanding. At the center of the island was a capital city of extraordinary design and wealth. Plato's description of this city is remarkably detailed. The capital was arranged in concentric circles, alternating rings of land and water, connected by bridges and tunnels. The outermost ring of water served as a harbor accessible from the sea through a great canal. The rings of land were protected by walls covered in precious metals. The outer wall was coated with brass, the middle wall with tin, and the innermost wall with orichalcum, a metal that Plato describes as gleaming like fire, though its exact identity remains unknown to us today. At the very center stood a temple dedicated to Poseidon, the sea god who was said to be the divine founder of Atlantis. This temple, according to Plato, was a stadium in length, roughly 600 feet, and proportionally wide and tall. Its exterior was covered entirely in silver, except for the pinnacles, which were gold. Inside stood a massive statue of Poseidon, driving a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses, surrounded by 100 Nereids riding dolphins. The island itself was described as remarkably fertile and resource-rich. It produced 2 harvests, each year watered by rain in winter and irrigation from springs in summer. The land yielded timber minerals, including the mysterious orichalcum, and an abundance of food. Elephants roamed there, Plato tells us, along with every other kind of animal. The Atlanteans had built an extensive infrastructure, a great canal system for irrigation and transportation, bridges, docks, and fortifications. But Plato's account is not simply a description of a utopia. It's a moral tale about the corruption of power. The Atlanteans, he explains, were initially a noble people, descendants of Poseidon himself. For many generations they lived virtuously, valuing wisdom and moderation over material wealth. But gradually, over time, their divine nature became diluted. They grew proud, ambitious, and hungry for conquest. They assembled a great military force and set out to subjugate the Mediterranean world. According to Plato, Atlantis waged war against the ancestors of the Athenians and other Mediterranean peoples. The Athenians, though vastly outnumbered, fought bravely and eventually defeated the Atlantean forces. But then came catastrophe. In a single day and night of terrible earthquakes and floods, the island of Atlantis sank beneath the waves and disappeared. The sea above it became unnavigable, choked with mud from the sunken island. And there, frustratingly, the story ends. The dialogue of Critias breaks off mid-sentence, leaving the account incomplete. Whether Plato intended to finish it and never did, or whether the ending was lost in the centuries of manuscript copying that followed, we don't know. So what are we to make of this account? For more than 2,000 years, readers have debated a fundamental question. Was Plato describing a real place? Or was he crafting an elaborate philosophical allegory? The case for allegory is substantial. Plato was, after all, a philosopher, not a historian. His dialogues were vehicles for exploring ideas about justice, governance, and the ideal society. In the Republic written before the Atlantis dialogues, he had already described an imaginary ideal city in great detail. Many scholars argue that Atlantis serves a similar purpose. It's a thought experiment, a cautionary tale about how even the most blessed civilization can fall into corruption and ruin. The very structure of the story supports this reading. Atlantis represents hubris and imperial ambition, while ancient Athens represents virtue and proper governance. The destruction of Atlantis becomes a moral lesson about divine justice. Supporting this interpretation is the fact that no other ancient Greek or Roman writer before Plato mentions Atlantis. If such a civilization had really existed and been remembered in Egyptian records, wouldn't other historians have written about it? Herodotus, who traveled extensively in Egypt and wrote detailed accounts of what he learned, there makes no mention of it. Neither do any Egyptian texts that have survived. Yet the case for historicity has its defenders. They point out that Plato's account contains an unusual level of specific detail, measurements, geographical descriptions, information about resources and animals. Why include such specifics if the whole thing was invented? They note that Plato explicitly presents the story as true, having Critias insist that the fact that it is not an invented fable but genuine history is all important. Some scholars suggest a middle ground. Perhaps Plato based his story on genuine historical memories, but adapted and embellished them for his philosophical purposes. Could the story of Atlantis preserve some echo of a real catastrophe, perhaps the Minoan civilization's destruction by the volcanic eruption, or the flooding of coastal settlements as sea levels rose after the last ice age? Could Plato have taken these fragmentary memories and woven them into a larger narrative that served his philosophical goals? The debate continues today as vigorous as ever. Archaeological discoveries have shown that ancient texts sometimes preserve accurate information about events long before they were written down. The city of Troy, once thought to be purely mythical, was discovered to be real. The same is true of Helike, as we've seen. Could Atlantis be another example? What we can say with certainty is that Plato's account has had an enormous impact on human culture. It established a template, a story structure, that would be repeated countless times in the millennia that followed. The pattern is always the same. A great civilization, blessed with knowledge and resources, grows proud and corrupt, and is destroyed by the forces of nature as divine punishment. This narrative has proven remarkably durable, appearing in different forms across cultures and centuries. Plato's Atlantis also established the idea that advanced civilizations might have existed in deep prehistory and been completely lost to memory. Before Plato, most Greek thinkers assumed that civilization was a relatively recent development, and that earlier ages had been more primitive. Plato suggested something different, that human achievement might be cyclical, that great civilizations could rise and fall, leaving little trace behind. Whether Plato intended his account as history or allegory, he created something that transcended his original purpose. He gave us a story that speaks to deep human concerns about the fragility of civilization, the dangers of hubris, and the possibility that much of our past remains unknown to us. He planted a seed that would grow into a vast forest of speculation, investigation, and wonder. The search for Atlantis, which we'll explore in coming chapters, has taken researchers to every ocean and continent. Some have looked for it in the Mediterranean, others in the Atlantic, still others in Antarctica, or the Caribbean, or the North Sea. The quest has produced both genuine archaeological discoveries and wild pseudoscience. But at its heart, the search for Atlantis is about more than finding a lost island. It's about understanding our past, testing the limits of what we know, and grappling with the possibility that human history might be far stranger and more complex than our textbooks suggest. Plato's dialogues remain our starting point, the original source that all other accounts must reference. And perhaps that's fitting. Whether he was recording ancient history or crafting philosophical fiction, Plato gave us a story that continues to challenge and intrigue us more than 2 millennia later. The question of Atlantis' reality may never be definitively answered, but the search itself has value, pushing us to explore, to question, and to remain open to the possibility that the past still has secrets to reveal. From Plato's philosophical dialogues, we turn now to a more recent catastrophe, one that we know for certain was real, and that may offer clues to understanding how ancient civilizations could vanish so completely. Santorini, Mediterranean candidate. If Plato's Atlantis was based on a real catastrophe, where might we find evidence of it? For many researchers, the answer lies not in the distant Atlantic, but much closer to Greece itself, on a crescent-shaped island in the Aegean Sea, known today as Santorini. The island's modern appearance offers the first clue to its violent past. Santorini isn't a single landmass, but a group of islands arranged in a rough circle around a deep lagoon. From the air, the pattern is unmistakable. These islands are the remnants of a much larger volcanic island that was torn apart by an explosion of almost unimaginable power. The lagoon at the center isn't a harbor carved by human hands. It's a caldera, a vast crater formed when the center of the volcano collapsed into the empty magma chamber below. The ancient Greeks knew this island as Thera, and sometime around 1600 BCE, during the height of the Bronze Age, Thera experienced one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded history. The evidence for this event is written in the geological record in layers of volcanic ash that can be found across the eastern Mediterranean, in tsunami deposits along coastlines hundreds of kilometers away, and in the very structure of the island itself. To understand the scale of what happened, scientists have compared the Thera eruption to other volcanic events in history. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, which killed more than 36,000 people and was heard 3,000 miles away, is often used as a reference point for massive volcanic disasters. The Thera eruption was approximately 4 times more powerful. It ejected an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of rock ash and pumice into the atmosphere, enough material to bury the entire island of Manhattan under nearly 400 meters of debris. The immediate effects would have been catastrophic. Volcanic ash would have darkened the sky across the region for days or weeks. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas and rock traveling at hundreds of kilometers per hour, would have incinerated everything on the island within minutes. And then came the tsunamis. When the center of the volcano collapsed into the sea, it displaced enormous volumes of water, generating waves that some researchers estimate reached heights of 40 meters or more as they struck nearby coastlines. But the most intriguing evidence of what happened at Thera wasn't discovered until the 20th century. In 1967, Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos began excavations at a site called Akrotiri on the southern coast of Santorini. What he found there would transform our understanding of Bronze Age civilization in the Aegean. Buried under meters of volcanic ash and pumice, Marinatos uncovered an entire ancient city, preserved in remarkable detail. The comparison to Pompeii is inevitable and apt. Both cities were frozen in time by volcanic eruptions, their buildings and artifacts protected by the very disaster that destroyed them. But Akrotiri is actually older than Pompeii by more than 1,500 years, and in some ways it reveals an even more sophisticated society. The buildings at Akrotiri were multi-story structures, some reaching 3 floors in height. They were constructed with advanced techniques, including wooden frameworks that provided earthquake resistance, a crucial feature in this seismically active region. Inside the walls were decorated with elaborate frescoes, showing scenes of daily life, religious ceremonies, and the natural world. These paintings are executed with remarkable skill, displaying a level of artistic sophistication that rivals anything produced elsewhere in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Perhaps most impressive was the city's infrastructure. Akrotiri had a sophisticated drainage system with ceramic pipes running beneath the streets to carry away wastewater. Individual houses had toilets connected to this system, a level of urban planning and sanitation that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for thousands of years. The city's streets were paved, and many buildings had large storage areas filled with pottery jars that once held grain, olive oil, and other provisions. One detail stands out as particularly poignant. Archaeologists have found no human remains at Akrotiri and very few valuable objects. This suggests that the inhabitants had warning, probably from preliminary earthquakes, and evacuated before the final catastrophic eruption. They took their most precious possessions with them, leaving behind the buildings, the frescoes, and the infrastructure of their daily lives. Where they went and what became of them, we don't know. The civilization that built Akrotiri is known to archaeologists as the Minoan culture, named after the legendary King Minos of Crete. The Minoans dominated the Aegean during the Bronze Age, establishing a network of palaces and trading posts across the islands. Their main center was on Crete, about 100 kilometers south of Thera, where they built elaborate palace complexes at Knossos Phaistos and other sites. The relationship between the Thera eruption and the decline of Minoan civilization has been debated for decades. Archaeological evidence shows that Minoan culture did indeed weaken significantly in the generations following the eruption. Many of their palaces on Crete were damaged or destroyed, and their influence in the wider Aegean diminished. Some researchers argue that the eruption dealt a devastating blow to Minoan power, destroying their fleet, disrupting their trade networks, and perhaps triggering social and political upheaval. Others suggest that the connection is less direct, and that Minoan decline resulted from a combination of factors over a longer period. What's clear is that the Thera eruption was a catastrophe of regional significance, one that would have been remembered for generations. And this brings us to the question that has fascinated researchers since Marinados first proposed it in the 1960s. Could the destruction of Thera be the historical event that inspired Plato's story of Atlantis? The parallels are striking. Both accounts describe an advanced island civilization destroyed suddenly by natural disaster. Both mention earthquakes and flooding. The Minoan culture, as revealed at Akrotiri, had the kind of sophisticated technology and urban planning that might seem almost miraculous to later observers. Elaborate multi-story buildings, advanced sanitation systems, beautiful art. If stories of this civilization and its destruction were passed down through the centuries, they might well have been embellished and mythologized along the way. There's also a possible transmission route. The Egyptians had contact with the Minoan world, and Egyptian records do contain references to the islands in the midst of the sea and to catastrophic events in the Aegean region. It's plausible that Egyptian priests in Sais could have had access to records or traditions about the Thera eruption, which they might have shared with Solon during his visit. Yet the theory faces significant challenges. The geography doesn't match Plato's description. Thera lies within the Aegean Sea, not beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. The timeline is also problematic. The Thera eruption occurred around 1600 BCE, not the 9600 BCE that Plato's account suggests. That's a difference of 8,000 years difficult to explain as a simple error in transmission. Supporters of the Thera-Atlantis connection have proposed various explanations for these discrepancies. Perhaps Plato deliberately changed the location to make his story more dramatic, or to distance it from known historical events. Perhaps the Egyptian priests made an error in their calculations, or Solon misunderstood their dating system. Perhaps the 9,000 years should be read as 900, or as 9 periods of some other unit of time. These explanations are possible, but they require us to assume significant alterations or errors in Plato's account. And if we're willing to accept that the location and date might be wrong, how much of the story can we still consider reliable? The debate continues among scholars with no clear consensus. What we can say with certainty is that Thera provides us with a documented example of exactly the kind of catastrophe that Plato described an advanced civilization on an island destroyed in a brief period by volcanic eruption, earthquakes, and flooding. Whether this is the specific event that inspired the Atlantis story, or simply one of many similar disasters that contributed to a broader cultural memory of lost civilizations, remains an open question. What Santorini demonstrates beyond doubt is that such catastrophes are not merely the stuff of legend. They happen. Advanced civilizations can be destroyed in days, buried under meters of ash, and forgotten for millennia. The archaeological record shows us that the boundary between existence and oblivion can be terrifyingly thin. A few days of volcanic fury were enough to erase Akrotiri from history, preserving it only as a time capsule waiting to be rediscovered more than 3,000 years later. This realization adds weight to the possibility that other lost civilizations might exist waiting to be found. If Akrotiri could remain hidden for so long, what else might be buried beneath the earth or the sea? The story of Santorini reminds us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that our knowledge of the past is incomplete, and that major discoveries can still reshape our understanding of ancient history. From the volcanic destruction of the Aegean, our search takes us to a very different kind of mystery. Not an island buried in ash, but structures hidden beneath the waters of the Caribbean, where some researchers believe they've found evidence of civilization in places that challenge our understanding of ancient history. Bimini Road, Mystery Under the Bahamas Sea. While researchers debate whether Santorini inspired Plato's tale, others have searched for Atlantis, in the location Plato actually specified beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. And in the warm, clear waters of the Bahamas, they believe they may have found something. September 2nd, 1968 was a day that would ignite decades of controversy. Marine zoologist J. Manson Valentine, along with divers Jacques Mayol and Robert Angove, were exploring the shallow waters off the coast of North Bimini, a small island in the Bahamas chain. What they discovered that day would become one of the most debated underwater structures in the world, a formation that some claim is evidence of an ancient civilization, while others insist is nothing more than an interesting geological feature. The structure they found lies in about 6 meters of water, running roughly parallel to the shore for approximately 800 meters. It consists of large rectangular blocks of limestone, each weighing several tons, arranged in what appears to be a remarkably straight line. The blocks are fitted together with surprising precision, and the overall formation curves gently, creating a shape that resembles the letter J when viewed from above. The discoverers called it the Bimini Road, though others have referred to it as the Bimini Wall, reflecting the ongoing debate about what it actually represents. What made this discovery particularly sensational was its apparent connection to a prediction made nearly 3 decades earlier. Edgar Cayce, an American mystic who claimed to receive information through psychic visions, had stated in 1940 that a portion of Atlantis would be discovered near Bimini in 1968 or 1969. When Valentine and his colleagues announced their find, believers in Casey's prophecies saw it as dramatic confirmation of his abilities. The timing seemed too precise to be coincidental. Valentine himself was cautious but intrigued. As a scientist, he understood the need for rigorous investigation. But the formation's appearance suggested human construction. The blocks seemed too regular, too well aligned to be entirely natural. He noted what appeared to be tool marks on some stones, and observed that certain blocks seemed to have been shaped to fit together. In subsequent dives, researchers identified what they interpreted as anchor stones with holes drilled through them, and what might be a stone ramp or slipway leading up from deeper water. The discovery attracted immediate attention from both the scientific community and the public. Throughout the 1970s, various researchers conducted surveys and excavations at the site. Some reported finding additional features, a second parallel line of stones, what might be foundation walls and other structures nearby. Proponents of the ancient construction theory argued that the formation showed clear evidence of human engineering. The blocks were too uniform, the alignment too precise, the overall design too purposeful to be accidental. Imagine for a moment diving down to examine these stones yourself. The water is remarkably clear, as it often is in the Bahamas, with visibility extending 30 meters or more. The limestone blocks rest on the sandy bottom, their surfaces smoothed by millennia of wave action, and colonized by marine life. Each block is roughly rectangular, perhaps 2 to 4 meters long and a meter or more wide. They fit together with minimal gaps, creating a continuous structure that extends into the blue distance. From this perspective, underwater, the impression of deliberate construction can be compelling. But scientific investigation requires more than visual impression. It demands careful analysis, measurement, and comparison with known geological processes. And this is where the controversy deepens. In 1978, geologist Eugene Shin from the United States Geological Survey conducted a detailed study of the Bimini Road. Shin and his team took core samples from the blocks, analyzed their composition and structure, and compared them with limestone formations elsewhere in the Bahamas. Their findings, published in 1980, challenged the ancient construction hypothesis. According to Shin's analysis, the blocks are beach rock, a type of limestone that forms naturally in tropical coastal environments. Beach rock develops when calcium carbonate dissolved in seawater precipitates and cements together sand shells and other sediments in the intertidal zone. This process can create extensive layers of solid rock that are remarkably uniform in thickness and composition. The Bimini blocks, Shin argued, are simply fragments of such a layer. The rectangular shape of the blocks, Shin explained, results from natural fracture patterns in the rock. Limestone tends to develop cracks along parallel planes due to stress and weathering. When these cracks intersect at roughly right angles, as they often do, the result is a pattern of rectangular blocks that can look remarkably like cut stone. The alignment of the blocks at Bimini, according to this interpretation, simply reflects the original orientation of the beach rock layer before it fractured. Shin's team also addressed the apparent precision of the block placement. They found that the blocks aren't actually as precisely fitted as they appear from above. There are significant gaps between many blocks filled with sand and smaller fragments. The impression of tight fitting is partly an optical illusion, created by the way light and shadow fall on the structure underwater. As for the age of the formation, radiocarbon dating of shells and other organic material embedded in the beach rock suggested it formed between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, long after Plato's supposed date for Atlantis, and well within the period of recorded history in the Mediterranean world. Yet the debate didn't end with Shin's study. Some researchers questioned his methodology and conclusions. They pointed out features that seemed difficult to explain through purely natural processes. Why, for instance, do the blocks at Bimini appear to be elevated slightly above the surrounding seafloor, resting on what look like pillar stones? Why are there apparent tool marks on some blocks? And why does the formation follow such a remarkably straight line for such a long distance? Dr. Greg Little, a psychologist and independent researcher who has conducted extensive surveys at Bimini, argues that while the blocks may indeed be beach rock, they show evidence of human modification and placement. He suggests that an ancient culture may have quarried the beach rock when it was still above water and used it to construct a harbor wall or breakwater. This would explain both the natural composition of the stone and the apparently artificial arrangement. The question of sea level adds another layer to the mystery. 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, when the beach rock formed according to Shin's dating sea levels were roughly similar to today's. But if we go back further to the end of the last ice age around 12,000 years ago, sea levels were significantly lower. The area where the Bimini Road now lies would have been dry land, part of a much larger landmass that connected the Bahamas Islands. Could there be older structures beneath the beach rock? Could the beach rock itself have formed over earlier human constructions? These questions remain unresolved. The challenge with underwater archaeology is that it's expensive, time-consuming, and technically difficult. Comprehensive excavation of the Bimini site would require removing tons of sand and sediment, working in currents and limited visibility, and carefully documenting everything found. Such projects require substantial funding and institutional support, which has been difficult to secure for a site that mainstream archaeology largely considers to be natural. The Bimini Road illustrates a fundamental challenge in the search for lost civilizations, distinguishing between natural formations and human constructions. Nature is capable of creating structures that appear remarkably artificial. Columnar basalt formations like the Giant's Causeway in Ireland or the Devil's Postpile in California consist of perfectly hexagonal stone columns that look machine-cut. Erosion can create walls, arches, and platforms that seem architectural. Even the arrangement of stones can sometimes follow patterns that appear deliberate, but result from natural sorting by water currents or geological forces. At the same time, the absence of obvious tool marks or mortar doesn't necessarily mean a structure isn't human-made. Ancient builders often worked with natural stone formations, selecting and arranging blocks without extensively modifying them. And structures that have been underwater for thousands of years would have their surfaces worn smooth, potentially erasing evidence of human work. The Bimini Road remains an enigma. The scientific consensus leans toward a natural explanation, but questions persist. The site continues to attract researchers, divers, and curious visitors. New surveys using modern technology occasionally reveal additional details that reignite the debate. And perhaps that's appropriate. Science advances by questioning, by remaining open to new evidence while maintaining rigorous standards of proof. What Bimini teaches us is humility. It reminds us that our ability to interpret the past is limited by the evidence available and by our own assumptions about what is possible. It shows us that nature can be a master architect, creating forms that challenge our understanding. And it suggests that the ocean floor may hold many more mysteries, some natural, some perhaps human-made, waiting to be properly understood. Whether the Bimini Road is a remnant of an ancient harbor or simply a fractured layer of beach rock, it serves a valuable purpose. It keeps us looking, questioning, and exploring. And in that search, we occasionally find genuine discoveries that expand our knowledge of human history. From the contested stones of Bimini, we travel now to the other side of the world, to waters off the coast of Japan, where an even more controversial underwater structure has sparked decades of debate about humanity's ancient past. Yonaguni, Japan's underwater pyramid. The debate over Bimini showed us how difficult it can be to distinguish natural formations from human constructions. But in the waters off Japan, an even more striking structure raises this question with greater urgency. Yonaguni is Japan's westernmost inhabited island, a small piece of land closer to Taiwan than to mainland Japan. It's a remote place, known primarily for its dramatic coastal cliffs and among divers for its populations of hammerhead sharks. But in 1987, local dive operator Kihachiro Aratake was exploring the waters off the island's southern coast when he encountered something that would spark one of the most intense archaeological debates of recent decades. At a depth of about 25 meters, Aratake found himself facing what appeared to be a massive stone structure. It wasn't a small formation. This was a monumental feature rising 27 meters from the seafloor and extending more than 120 meters in length. The structure consisted of sandstone arranged in what looked like terraces, platforms, and steps. There were flat surfaces that resembled plazas' vertical walls that looked like they'd been cut with precision, and right angles that seemed too perfect to be accidental. Aratake reported his discovery, and soon divers and researchers began visiting the site. What they documented was extraordinary. The main structure features what appears to be a series of wide, flat terraces connected by steep steps. Some of these steps are remarkably uniform, each about 20 centimeters high, creating a staircase effect. There are channels that look like roads or pathways. There are formations that some observers have interpreted as pillars walls, and even a triangular feature that's been called a turtle, due to its shape. The discovery attracted the attention of Professor Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus. Kimura would go on to spend more than 15 years studying the Yonaguni Formation, conducting hundreds of dives and documenting every detail of the structure. His conclusion, stated with increasing confidence over the years, was that this was not a natural formation, but the ruins of an ancient city. Kimura's interpretation is based on several observations. He points to features that he believes show clear evidence of human modification: straight edges, right angles, and symmetrical arrangements that would be unlikely to occur naturally. He's identified what he interprets as specific architectural elements: a main gate, a castle, a stadium, roads, and even what might be carved representations of animals. He's also found what appear to be tool marks on some surfaces, and has collected what he believes are stone tools from the site. The implications of Kimura's interpretation are profound. If the Yonaguni structure is indeed human-made, when was it built? The key to answering this question lies in sea level history. The structure currently sits at a depth of 25 meters. Sea levels have been relatively stable for the past few thousand years, which means that if humans built this structure, they must have done so when sea levels were lower, which takes us back to the end of the last ice age, approximately 10,000 years ago or more. This dating would make Yonaguni older than the Egyptian, pyramids older than Stonehenge, older than most of what we consider ancient civilization. It would suggest that sophisticated architectural capabilities existed far earlier than mainstream archaeology currently accepts. It would require us to reconsider our understanding of human technological development in East Asia during the Stone Age. These are extraordinary claims, and in science, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is where the controversy intensifies because not all researchers agree with Kimura's interpretation. In 1997, Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, visited Yonaguni to examine the structure firsthand. Schoch had previously gained attention for his controversial work on the Sphinx in Egypt, where he argued for an earlier date based on water erosion patterns. He approached Yonaguni with an open mind, prepared to evaluate the evidence objectively. After multiple dives and careful examination, Schoch concluded that the Yonaguni structure is primarily, if not entirely, natural. His reasoning is based on the geology of sandstone and the known processes of weathering and erosion. Sandstone, Schoch explains, is a sedimentary rock that forms in layers. Over time, it develops fractures along parallel planes due to tectonic stress and other geological processes. When these fractures intersect at roughly right angles, which commonly happens, the result is a pattern of rectangular blocks and flat surfaces. Water erosion, particularly the action of waves and currents, tends to exploit these natural fractures, gradually widening them and creating the appearance of separate blocks or terraces. The flat surfaces at Yonaguni, according to Shok, are simply bedding planes, the original horizontal layers of sediment that formed the sandstone millions of years ago. The vertical walls are fracture planes. The steps are the edges of these layers exposed by erosion. Shok points out that similar formations can be found elsewhere in the world, including on land where there's no question of human involvement. He notes that the Yonaguni structure shows no clear evidence of quarrying, no obvious tool marks that couldn't be explained by natural processes, and no artifacts that would definitively indicate human presence. The symmetry and right angles that seem so compelling underwater are, he argues, well within the range of what natural geological processes can produce. However, even Shok acknowledges that some features at Yonaguni are puzzling. There are certain details, particularly some circular holes and specific angular cuts, that are difficult to explain through purely natural processes. He suggests that while the main structure is natural, humans may have modified some features, perhaps using the formation as a quarry or incorporating it into some kind of ceremonial site. This would make Yonaguni a hybrid, primarily natural, but with some human alteration. This middle ground interpretation hasn't satisfied either side of the debate. Kimura continues to argue for full human construction, pointing to features he believes Shok hasn't adequately explained. Other researchers have proposed various compromise positions. Perhaps the structure is natural, but was extensively modified by humans. Or perhaps humans built structures on top of a natural formation, and those structures have since eroded away, leaving only the modified bedrock. The debate has been complicated by the difficulty of conducting thorough archaeological investigation underwater. Excavation is expensive and technically challenging. Visibility at Yonaguni can be limited, and strong currents make diving dangerous. The depth puts the site at the limit of conventional scuba diving, requiring special training and equipment. These practical constraints mean that much of the evidence remains observational rather than based on systematic excavation and analysis. There's also the question of context. If Yonaguni is human-made, where are the associated artifacts? Where are the tools, the pottery, the remains of daily life that we find at every known ancient settlement? Kimura has reported finding some stone tools, but these haven't been definitively dated or proven to be associated with the structure itself. Without a clear assemblage of artifacts, it's difficult to establish human presence, much less a sophisticated building culture. The Yonaguni controversy highlights a fundamental challenge in archaeology and geology, the interpretation of ambiguous evidence. When we look at ancient structures on land, we have contexts surrounding artifacts, construction techniques we can compare to known methods, often written records, or at least oral traditions. Underwater, especially at sites that might be very ancient, much of this context is missing. We're left with the structure itself, and reasonable people can look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions. What makes this particularly challenging is that both natural and human processes can produce similar results. Humans often work with natural features, modifying them rather than building from scratch. Ancient builders frequently took advantage of natural rock formations, cutting and shaping them to suit their purposes. The result can be something that's neither entirely natural nor entirely artificial, but a combination of both. This ambiguity is frustrating for those seeking definitive answers, but it's also what makes the investigation fascinating. Each new survey, each new analytical technique, each new comparison with other sites adds to our understanding. The debate over Yonaguni has led to more careful study of how sandstone weathers in marine environments, better documentation of natural rock formations that resemble architecture, and more rigorous standards for identifying genuine human modification of stone. Whether Yonaguni is natural, artificial, or something in between, it serves an important function in the search for lost civilizations. It reminds us that our ancestors were capable of impressive feats, that coastal settlements from the end of the Ice Age are now underwater, and that the ocean floor likely holds many more secrets about human history. It also reminds us of the importance of rigorous, scientific method of not seeing what we want to see, but carefully evaluating all possible explanations for what we observe. The structure remains there 25 meters below the surface, unchanged by the debates happening above. Divers continue to visit it, researchers continue to study it, and the controversy continues. Perhaps future technology will provide clearer answers, more sophisticated dating methods, better imaging technology, or new analytical techniques that can definitively determine whether the features at Yonaguni are natural or artificial. Until then, Yonaguni stands as a monument to uncertainty, a reminder that the past still holds mysteries that resist easy interpretation. It challenges us to remain both open-minded and skeptical, to consider extraordinary possibilities, while demanding solid evidence and to accept that some questions may not have simple answers. From the contested waters off Japan, we turn now to a very different kind of lost civilization, one that began not as an archaeological discovery, but as a scientific hypothesis that gradually transformed into myth. Lemuria, the lost continent of the Indian Ocean. Not all lost continents begin as legends. Some start as scientific hypotheses proposed by respected researchers to explain genuine puzzles in the natural world. The story of Lemuria is one such case, a tale of how legitimate science can transform into myth, and how the boundary between the two can become surprisingly blurred. The year was 1864, and British zoologist Philip Lutley Sclater was studying the geographical distribution of lemurs, those distinctive primates with large eyes and long tails. Sclater had noticed something peculiar in the fossil record and the distribution of living species. Lemur fossils and related species were found in Madagascar off the east coast of Africa, and in India, thousands of kilometers away across the Indian Ocean. Yet they were absent from Africa itself and from the Middle East, the lands that lay between these two regions. This distribution pattern made no sense according to the geographical understanding of the time. How could related species exist on Madagascar and India, but not in the territories connecting them? Animals don't cross vast oceans. There had to be an explanation. Sclater proposed a solution that seemed reasonable, given the scientific knowledge of his era. He suggested that a land bridge, or even a small continent, had once connected Madagascar and India, allowing lemurs and other animals to spread across it. When this landmass subsequently sank beneath the Indian Ocean, it left isolated populations on the remaining islands and continents. Sclater named this hypothetical land bridge Lemuria, after the lemurs whose distribution it was meant to explain. The idea was not as far-fetched as it might sound today. In the mid-19th century, geologists were still developing their understanding of how the Earth's surface had changed over time. The theory of continental drift wouldn't be proposed until 1912, and plate tectonics, our modern understanding of how continents move, wasn't established until the 1960s. Scientists of Sclater's time knew that sea levels had changed throughout Earth's history, and they had evidence that land bridges had indeed connected various regions in the past. Britain had been connected to continental Europe. Asia and North America had been linked across what is now the Bering Strait. Why not a connection across the Indian Ocean? Sclater's hypothesis gained support from other scientists. The German biologist Ernst Haeckel, one of the most influential naturalists of his time and a strong advocate of Darwin's theory of evolution, embraced the idea of Lemuria. Haeckel went further than Sclater, suggesting that Lemuria might have been the original homeland of the human species, the place where our ancestors first evolved before spreading to other continents. For several decades, Lemuria remained a legitimate, if speculative, scientific hypothesis. It appeared in textbooks and scientific papers. Researchers debated its size, its exact location, and when it might have existed. Some proposed that it was a small land bridge, while others imagined a continent-sized landmass stretching across much of the Indian Ocean. But as geological knowledge advanced, the scientific basis for Lemuria began to crumble. The development of plate tectonic theory in the 20th century revealed that continents don't sink beneath the oceans. They're made of lighter rock that floats on the denser mantle below. The theory explained the distribution of lemurs and other species in a different way. Madagascar, India, Africa, and Antarctica had once been joined together as part of the supercontinent Gondwana. When Gondwana broke apart and the pieces drifted to their current positions, populations of various species were separated, evolving independently over millions of years. By the mid-20th century, mainstream science had abandoned Lemuria. The hypothesis was no longer needed to explain the distribution of lemurs or any other species. The mystery Sclater had tried to solve had been answered by plate tectonics, and Lemuria became a footnote in the history of scientific ideas, an interesting example of how scientists work with the best available theories until better explanations come along. But something remarkable happened. Just as Lemuria was being discarded by science, it was being embraced by mysticism and spirituality. The concept took on a new life, transformed from a geological hypothesis into something far more elaborate and fantastical. The transformation began with Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a Russian mystic who founded the Theosophical Society in 1875. Blavatsky claimed to have access to ancient wisdom transmitted by spiritual masters. In 1888, she published The Secret Doctrine, a massive work that presented an alternative history of humanity based on what she claimed were ancient texts from Tibet and other sources. In Blavatsky's telling, Lemuria was not merely a land bridge for animals, it was the homeland of the third root race of humanity. She described the Lemurians as beings quite different from modern humans. They were enormous in size, perhaps 4 to 5 meters tall, with 4 arms and an eye in the back of their heads. They were hermaphroditic and reproduced by laying eggs. They communicated telepathically and possessed psychic powers that modern humans have lost. This civilization, according to Blavatsky, existed millions of years ago and was eventually destroyed by volcanic catastrophes. Blavatsky's Lemuria bore little resemblance to Sclater's scientific hypothesis. She had taken the name and the basic concept of a sunken land in the Indian Ocean and built an elaborate mythology around it. Her work combined elements from various religious and philosophical traditions, creating a narrative that appealed to those interested in alternative spirituality and ancient mysteries. The theosophical version of Lemuria influenced numerous other writers and movements. In the early 20th century, various authors expanded on Blavatsky's ideas, adding new details about Lemurian civilization, technology, and spirituality. Some connected Lemuria to other lost continents, suggesting that survivors of its destruction had founded Atlantis or other ancient civilizations. The concept appeared in science fiction, fantasy literature, and New Age spirituality. Interestingly, the idea of a sunken land in the Indian Ocean also appears in traditional sources that predate both Sclater and Blavatsky. Ancient Tamil literature from South India contains references to Kumari Kandam, a continent that was said to lie south of present-day India before being swallowed by the sea. Tamil scholars and poets describe this land as the original home of Tamil civilization, a place where great literary academies flourished before the ocean claimed it. The Kumari Kandam tradition is complex and its origins are debated. Some of the references appear in texts that are genuinely ancient, while others are from later periods. Some scholars suggest that these stories may preserve cultural memories of coastal lands lost to rising sea levels after the last ice age, a real phenomenon that affected coastlines around the Indian Ocean. Others view Kumari Kandam as a mythological construct, similar to other cultural stories about lost golden ages. When theosophists and later writers learned about Kumari Kandam, they often conflated it with Lemuria, seeing them as references to the same lost continent. This created a feedback loop where scientific hypothesis, Western mysticism, and Indian tradition became intertwined, each lending apparent credibility to the others. Today, mainstream science is clear there was no continent-sized landmass in the Indian Ocean that sank within the time frame of human existence. The geology doesn't support it, and we have detailed maps of the ocean floor that show no evidence of such a landmass. The distribution of lemurs and other species is well explained by plate tectonics and evolution, without needing to invoke a sunken continent. However, this doesn't mean there's no truth whatsoever in stories of lost lands in the Indian Ocean. Sea levels have indeed changed dramatically. During the last ice age, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today. Areas that are now shallow seas like the Persian Gulf and parts of the ocean around Indonesia were dry land. Coastal settlements from that era are now underwater. In this sense, there are lost lands in the Indian Ocean, even if they're not the continent-sized Lemuria of legend. The story of Lemuria offers important lessons for our investigation of lost civilizations. It shows how scientific hypotheses can be transformed into myths, how legitimate questions about the past can spawn elaborate fantasies, and how difficult it can be to separate fact from fiction once the two have become entangled. It also demonstrates the human need for lost golden ages, for stories of ancient wisdom and vanished paradises. Lemuria, in its mystical form, serves a psychological and cultural function. It represents a time when humanity was supposedly more spiritual, more connected to nature, more in tune with cosmic forces. The loss of Lemuria becomes a metaphor for what we've lost in our modern materialistic age. Yet the appeal of such stories shouldn't prevent us from asking hard questions about evidence and plausibility. The transformation of Lemuria from scientific hypothesis to spiritual mythology is a cautionary tale about the importance of distinguishing between what we can demonstrate and what we merely wish to believe. As we continue our exploration of lost civilizations, we carry this lesson with us. Some lost lands are real, documented by geology and archaeology. Others are constructs of imagination and desire. The challenge is to tell them apart, to remain open to genuine discoveries, while maintaining the critical thinking that prevents us from being misled by appealing but unsupported claims. From the mystical Lemuria of the Indian Ocean, we turn to another lost continent of the Pacific. One that, like Lemuria, began with a claim of ancient knowledge, but took on a life of its own in popular imagination. Mu, Churchward's Pacific continent. While Lemuria emerged from legitimate scientific inquiry before transforming into myth, another lost continent was born from a very different source. One man's claim to have decoded ancient tablets that revealed a civilization spanning the Pacific Ocean. In 1926, British-American writer James Churchward published The Lost Continent of Mu, the first in a series of books that would captivate readers for decades. Churchward's story was extraordinary. He claimed that as a young man serving in India, during the 1880s he had befriended an Indian priest who showed him a collection of ancient clay tablets. These tablets, the priest explained, were written in a forgotten language called Nakal, the original tongue of humanity. Over the course of several years, the priest taught Churchward to read this language, revealing a history that contradicted everything scholars believed about human civilization. According to Churchward's translation, these tablets told of Mu, a vast continent that had once existed in the Pacific Ocean. This wasn't a small landmass or a chain of islands. Churchward described Mu as stretching from Hawaii in the north to Easter Island in the east and Fiji in the west, covering an area of approximately 5,000 miles from east to west and 3,000 miles from north to south. On this continent, he claimed lived 64 million people, organized into 10 tribes or nations ruled by a priest-king called Ra-Mu. The civilization of Mu, as Churchward described it, was remarkably advanced. The people had developed sophisticated architecture, creating great cities with stone temples and palaces. They had mastered navigation, sending ships across the Pacific to establish colonies in the Americas, Asia, and other lands. They had a written language complex, religious beliefs, and scientific knowledge. Mu, according to Churchward, was the mother civilization, the source from which all other ancient cultures had sprung. Then approximately 12,000 years ago, catastrophe struck. A series of massive earthquakes and volcanic eruptions tore the continent apart. In Churchward's account, the destruction was sudden and total. Gas-filled chambers beneath Mu collapsed, causing the entire continent to sink beneath the waves in a matter of days. Millions perished. Only a few survivors escaped to distant lands, carrying fragments of Mu's knowledge and culture with them. This was a compelling narrative, made more so by Churchward's presentation. He wrote with confidence and authority, citing not only the Nakal tablets, but also other ancient sources. He claimed to have studied temple inscriptions in Mexico, stone tablets in Tibet, and various archaeological findings from around the Pacific. He included diagrams, maps, and photographs in his books, giving them the appearance of scholarly works. Churchward's central argument rested on the observation of cultural similarities across the Pacific region. He pointed out that pyramid-like structures appeared in Egypt, Mexico, and Southeast Asia. He noted that various cultures had flood myths and stories of catastrophic destruction. He observed that certain symbols, particularly those related to the sun, appeared in widely separated civilizations. How could such similarities exist, he asked, unless these cultures shared a common origin in Mu? The theory had particular appeal in the 1920s and 1930s. This was an era of great archaeological discoveries: King Tut's tomb, the Indus Valley civilization, the ruins of the Hittites. The world seemed full of lost civilizations waiting to be rediscovered. Why not Mu? The Pacific Ocean was vast and largely unexplored. Who could say with certainty what might lie beneath its waters? But from the beginning, scholars raised serious questions about Churchward's claims. The most fundamental problem was the complete absence of verifiable evidence. The Nakal tablets that supposedly formed the basis of his entire theory were never produced for examination. Churchward claimed they remained in India in the possession of the priest who had shown them to him, but he provided no way for other researchers to verify their existence or his translation of them. The other ancient sources he cited were equally problematic. When archaeologists and linguists examined the inscriptions and texts Churchward referenced, they found that his interpretations bore little resemblance to accepted translations. In many cases, he seemed to have misread or misunderstood the material entirely. His evidence from various archaeological sites often consisted of taking symbols or structures out of context and assigning them meanings that fit his theory, regardless of what local scholars understood them to represent. More fundamentally, the geology simply doesn't support the existence of a Pacific continent. The Pacific Ocean floor has been extensively mapped and studied, particularly since the development of plate tectonic theory. What we've learned is that the Pacific Basin is fundamentally different from continental crust. It's made of denser basaltic rock that forms at mid-ocean ridges and gradually spreads outward. Continental crust, by contrast, is lighter and more buoyant. It doesn't sink beneath the ocean. There is no mechanism by which a continent-sized landmass could have existed in the Pacific and then disappeared within the time frame of human history. The islands that do exist in the Pacific, Hawaii, Easter Island, Fiji, and others, are volcanic in origin. They formed as the Pacific Plate moved over stationary hotspots in the Earth's mantle, creating chains of volcanic islands. These islands have never been connected to a larger continent. Geological surveys have found no evidence of submerged continental platforms in the regions where Churchward placed Mu. As for the cultural similarities, Churchward cited modern archaeology and anthropology offer more plausible explanations. Pyramid-like structures appear in different cultures, not because they all learned the technique from Mu, but because a pyramid is a stable logical form for building large stone structures with primitive technology. It's an example of convergent evolution, different cultures independently arriving at similar solutions to similar problems. The flood myths that appear in many cultures around the Pacific and elsewhere can be explained by the real experience of rising sea levels after the last ice age, by local flooding events, and by the universal human experience of living near water where floods are a recurring danger. These stories don't require a single catastrophic event or a lost continent to explain them. The spread of certain cultural elements across the Pacific is now understood to have occurred through migration and trade. Polynesian navigators, for instance, were extraordinarily skilled seafarers who settled islands across vast stretches of ocean, carrying their culture and technology with them. Archaeological and genetic evidence traces these migrations in detail, showing how and when different island groups were settled. There's no need to invoke a lost continent to explain cultural connections when we have evidence of actual historical contact between peoples. Despite the lack of scientific support, Churchward's books remained popular. They appealed to a sense of mystery and wonder, to the idea that there might be hidden chapters of human history waiting to be rediscovered. The notion of Mu influenced fiction writers, inspired expeditions, and became part of popular culture. Even today, the lost continent of Mu appears in novels, films, and alternative history theories. The story of Mu teaches us important lessons about the difference between speculation and evidence. Churchward created an elaborate theory complete with maps, timelines, and detailed descriptions. He wrote with confidence and cited numerous sources. But confidence and citation are not the same as proof. His sources couldn't be verified, his translations were questionable, and his theory contradicted established geological and archaeological knowledge. Yet the appeal of Mu points to something genuine, a recognition that the Pacific Ocean has indeed played a crucial role in human history, and that there are real mysteries about how ancient peoples navigated and settled this vast region. The actual story of Pacific exploration and settlement, as revealed by archaeology and genetics, is in many ways more remarkable than Churchward's fiction. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean in outrigger canoes, using their knowledge of stars waves and birds to find tiny islands. They established thriving cultures on remote specks of land, adapting to diverse environments from tropical atolls to temperate New Zealand. The cultural similarities that Churchward noted are real, but they reflect historical connections between peoples, not a lost continent. The question isn't why these similarities exist, it's how ancient peoples achieved the remarkable feat of maintaining cultural connections across such vast distances. That's a question worth exploring, one that doesn't require us to invent continents that never existed. Churchward's Mu reminds us to be skeptical of grand claims that lack verifiable evidence, no matter how appealing they might be. It shows us the importance of distinguishing between what we can demonstrate and what we merely imagine, and it illustrates how the desire for mystery and the unknown can lead us to embrace elaborate fictions, when the truth, though less dramatic, is ultimately more interesting and more valuable. From the imagined continent of Mu, we turn now to a place that exists in a different category entirely, neither a geological feature nor a purely fictional creation, but something in between, a hidden realm that appears in ancient texts and spiritual traditions sought by explorers, yet understood by many as existing beyond the physical world. Dwarka, Krishna's city under the sea. Unlike the invented continents of Mu and Lemuria, some lost cities exist first in sacred texts, before archaeology begins searching for them. The story of Dwarka is one such case, a place described in ancient religious literature that may have been discovered beneath the waves. The Mahabharata, one of the two great Sanskrit epics of ancient India, tells the story of Dwarka as the magnificent capital city of Lord Krishna. According to the text, Krishna established this city on the western coast of India after leaving Mathura. The descriptions are vivid and detailed. Dwarka was built on an island protected by massive walls and fortifications. It had elaborate gates covered in gold grand palaces and wide streets laid out in a grid pattern. The city was said to be prosperous and beautiful, a center of culture and learning. The Mahabharata also describes Dwarka's end. After Krishna's death, the text states that the city was swallowed by the sea. For centuries, this was understood as mythology, a symbolic story about the impermanence of even the greatest achievements. The idea that Dwarka might have been a real place that actually sank beneath the ocean seemed as fantastical as any legend. But in the late 20th century, something changed. Archaeologists began to wonder, what if the story contained a kernel of historical truth? What if there had been a real city on the Gujarat coast that was lost to rising seas or coastal erosion? And if so, could any trace of it remain? The search for underwater Dwarka began in the 1980s under the direction of Dr. S.R. Rao, a pioneering Indian marine archaeologist. Rao had already made significant contributions to Indian archaeology, including excavations at Lothal, an important Indus Valley civilization site. Now he turned his attention to the waters off the modern town of Dwarka in Gujarat, which had long been considered a sacred pilgrimage site associated with Krishna. Rao's team conducted systematic surveys of the seabed using side-scan sonar and diving expeditions. What they found was intriguing. At depths ranging from 10 to 40 meters, they discovered stone structures that appeared to be walls arranged in patterns that suggested human construction. They found large stone blocks, some with what looked like deliberate shaping. They recovered stone anchors of a type used in ancient maritime trade. The structures extended over a considerable area, suggesting a settlement of significant size. The discoveries generated considerable excitement, particularly among those who saw them as confirmation of the Mahabharata's historical accuracy. But they also raised questions. Were these structures truly the remains of an ancient city, or could they be natural rock formations? If they were human-made, how old were they and what culture had built them? In 2000 and 2001, the National Institute of Ocean Technology conducted more extensive surveys of the site using advanced sonar equipment. These surveys revealed structures spread over an area of approximately 9 square kilometers. The sonar images showed what appeared to be rectangular and square patterns, geometric shapes that suggested deliberate planning and construction. The team collected samples of wood and pottery from the site for analysis. The most striking finding came from radiocarbon dating of some of the wood samples. The results suggested dates of approximately 7,500 years before present, which would place the site in the Neolithic period, thousands of years before the Indus Valley civilization, and far earlier than most scholars had believed urban settlements existed in this region. If confirmed, this would make the underwater structures at Dwarka among the oldest city remains ever discovered. These findings sparked intense debate. Some researchers, particularly in India, embrace the results as evidence that Indian civilization was far more ancient than previously recognized. They saw Dwarka as proof that the Mahabharata preserved genuine historical memories, and that sophisticated urban culture had developed in India earlier than the established archaeological timeline suggested. Other scholars urged caution. The interpretation of underwater structures is notoriously difficult. Natural geological formations can create patterns that appear artificial, especially when viewed through sonar in the limited visibility conditions common in these waters. The stone blocks at Dwarka could be beach rock naturally cemented sediment that has fractured into regular shapes. The walls might be natural ridges, or the remains of more recent structures. The dating evidence, while intriguing, also faces scrutiny. Radiocarbon dates from marine environments can be complicated by various factors, including the reservoir effect, where carbon from ancient sources makes samples appear older than they actually are. The wood samples could have come from driftwood or other sources not directly associated with the structures. More systematic excavation and dating of multiple samples would be needed to establish a reliable chronology. The practical challenges of investigating the site are substantial. The waters off Dwarka are subject to strong currents and tidal flows, making diving difficult and dangerous. Visibility is often poor due to suspended sediment. The depth of some structures puts them at the limit of conventional scuba diving, requiring technical diving skills and equipment. Systematic excavation underwater is far more complex and expensive than land-based archaeology. There's also the question of context. If the structures at Dwarka are indeed human-made and as old as some dates suggest, where are the associated artifacts? Ancient cities produce vast quantities of material, culture pottery tools, ornaments, and everyday objects. Some pottery and stone anchors have been recovered from the Dwarka site, but not in the quantities one would expect from a major urban center. This absence makes some archaeologists skeptical about interpreting the structures as a city. Yet the investigation continues. More recent surveys have documented additional features at the site, including what some researchers interpret as a possible harbor structure and defensive walls. Advances in underwater archaeology techniques, including better imaging technology and remote-operated vehicles, are providing new ways to study the site without the limitations of human divers. The debate over Dwarka touches on larger questions about the relationship between mythology and history. The Mahabharata is a religious and literary text, not a historical chronicle. It was composed over many centuries with layers of material added by different authors. It contains supernatural elements, moral teachings, and symbolic narratives. Yet it's also set in a recognizable geographical landscape and mentions many real places. Scholars have long debated whether the epic preserves any historical memories. Some argue that it may reflect a distant memory of conflicts and migrations during the Late Bronze Age or Early Iron Age in India. Others see it as primarily mythological with any historical elements, so transformed by centuries of oral transmission and literary elaboration that they're impossible to recover. The underwater structures at Dwarka offer a potential way to test these questions. If they can be definitively dated and identified as an ancient city, it would demonstrate that at least some elements of the Mahabharata's geography are based on real places. This wouldn't prove that Krishna was a historical figure or that the epic's events actually occurred, but it would show that the text's authors had knowledge of ancient settlements that had been lost to the sea. The case of Dwarka represents a different category of lost civilization from Atlantis or Mu. Unlike those, Dwarka is not claimed to be a continent or a mother civilization. It's a single city described in texts that are ancient but not prehistoric. The search for it is grounded in legitimate archaeology, using scientific methods and subject to peer review. The findings, while debated, are published in academic journals and examined by the scholarly community. This makes Dwarka particularly interesting for our investigation. It shows how archaeology can engage with traditional narratives, testing them against physical evidence. It demonstrates both the possibilities and the challenges of underwater archaeology. And it illustrates how difficult it can be to reach definitive conclusions when the evidence is fragmentary and the site is difficult to access. Whether the structures off Gujarat are the Dwarka of the Mahabharata, an earlier settlement that inspired the epic's descriptions, or natural formations that happen to resemble human construction, remains an open question. What's clear is that the investigation has revealed something significant beneath those waters, structures that merit continued study and careful interpretation. The story of Dwarka reminds us that sacred texts, while not historical documents in the modern sense, sometimes preserve information about real places and events. It shows us that the boundary between myth and history is not always clear, and that archaeological investigation can sometimes find unexpected connections between ancient stories and physical remains. And it demonstrates that the search for lost civilizations is most productive when it combines respect for traditional knowledge with rigorous scientific methodology. From the contested waters off India, we turn now to a very different kind of lost realm, one that exists not beneath the ocean, but hidden within the mountains, a place that many believe exists on a spiritual rather than physical plane. Shambhala, the hidden kingdom of Tibet. While we've explored lost civilizations beneath the ocean and buried under volcanic ash, there exists as another category of hidden realm, one that may not be lost at all but simply concealed from those who are not ready to find it. In the spiritual traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, Shambhala occupies a unique place. It is described not as a civilization that was destroyed, but as a kingdom that continues to exist hidden somewhere in the vast expanses of Central Asia. Unlike Atlantis or Mu, which are said to have sunk catastrophically beneath the waves, Shambhala is believed to be protected by spiritual barriers that make it invisible or inaccessible to ordinary perception. It represents not what was lost, but what remains preserved, a sanctuary of wisdom, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to the world. The earliest detailed descriptions of Shambhala appear in the Kalachakra Tantra, a complex Buddhist text that emerged in India around the 10th century CE before being transmitted to Tibet. According to this text, Shambhala is a kingdom shaped like an 8-petaled lotus, with the capital city of Kalapa at its center. The realm is divided into 96 provinces, each governed by regional leaders, all under the authority of a line of enlightened kings, known as the Kulika kings or Kalki kings. The Kalachakra texts provide specific details about Shambhala's geography and culture. The kingdom is said to be surrounded by a great range of snow mountains, making it difficult to access from the outside world. Within these mountains lies a land of great beauty and prosperity, where the inhabitants live in harmony with Buddhist teachings. The people of Shambhala are described as possessing advanced spiritual knowledge and living extraordinarily long lives. They practice the Kalachakra teachings in their purest form, maintaining traditions that have been corrupted or lost in the outside world. Central to the Shambhala narrative is a prophecy. According to the texts, the world will eventually descend into an age of darkness when materialistic values dominate and spiritual teachings are forgotten or distorted. At that critical moment, the 25th Kulika king of Shambhala will emerge with a great army to defeat the forces of darkness and usher in a new golden age. This prophecy has made Shambhala not just a hidden kingdom, but a symbol of hope, a promise that wisdom and compassion will ultimately prevail over ignorance and cruelty. For Tibetan Buddhists, Shambhala has traditionally been understood on multiple levels. Some teachers present it as a physical place that could theoretically be reached by someone with sufficient spiritual development and the right karmic connections. Others interpret it as existing in a different dimension or plane of reality, accessible through meditation and spiritual practice rather than physical travel. Still others view it primarily as a metaphor, a representation of the enlightened mind or the ideal Buddhist society. This ambiguity about Shambhala's nature, physical, spiritual, or symbolic, hasn't prevented people from searching for it as a geographical location. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as Western explorers and scholars gained access to Tibetan texts and traditions, the legend of Shambhala captured imaginations far beyond Buddhist circles. One of the most notable seekers was Nicholas Roerich, a Russian painter, philosopher, and explorer. Between 1925 and 1928, Roerich led an expedition through Central Asia, traveling through Sikkim, Kashmir, Ladakh, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Tibet. Though the expedition had multiple purposes, artistic, scientific, and diplomatic, Roerich was deeply interested in finding Shambhala, or at least identifying the geographical location that had inspired the legend. Roerich's writings suggest he believed Shambhala might be located in the Altai Mountains region, or perhaps in a hidden valley in Tibet or Mongolia. He collected local legends and traditions about sacred mountains and hidden valleys, looking for clues that might point to Shambhala's location. His expedition produced valuable ethnographic and geographical information, along with hundreds of paintings documenting the landscapes and peoples of Central Asia. However, he never claimed to have found Shambhala itself, and his writings maintain a careful ambiguity about whether he was searching for a physical place or a spiritual reality. The search for Shambhala took a darker turn in the 1930s, when Nazi Germany became interested in the legend. The Nazi ideology, with its obsession with racial origins and occult power, saw in Shambhala a possible source of ancient Aryan wisdom. In 1938 and 1939, the SS sent expeditions to Tibet ostensibly for scientific purposes, but also seeking evidence for their racial theories and possibly searching for Shambhala. These expeditions found no evidence of hidden kingdoms or ancient Aryan civilizations, but they represent one of the more troubling chapters in the history of searching for lost realms. After World War II, interest in Shambhala continued, though generally in less sinister forms. The legend became part of New Age spirituality, often blended with ideas about hidden masters, underground civilizations, and UFOs. These popular interpretations moved far from the original Buddhist teachings, transforming Shambhala into a kind of spiritual Shangri-La, a term itself borrowed from James Hilton's 1933 novel Lost Horizon, which described a hidden valley in Tibet where people lived in peace and near immortality. Modern Buddhist scholars and teachers have generally emphasized the spiritual rather than geographical nature of Shambhala. The Dalai Lama, for instance, has taught extensively on the Kalachakra Tantra and has stated that while Shambhala may correspond to some physical location, its primary significance is spiritual. In this interpretation, the journey to Shambhala is an inner journey of spiritual development, and the kingdom represents the fully awakened mind. Yet some researchers have attempted to identify historical kingdoms or regions that might have inspired the Shambhala legend. One possibility is the ancient kingdom of Zhangzhung in western Tibet, which predated the introduction of Buddhism to Tibet and had its own sophisticated religious tradition. Another candidate is the Swat Valley in what is now Pakistan, which was an important center of Buddhist learning in ancient times and fits some of the geographical descriptions in the texts. The kingdom of Khotan, an ancient Buddhist state on the Silk Road in what is now Xinjiang, China, has also been proposed. Khotan was known for its Buddhist scholarship and maintained its independence and Buddhist culture for centuries, while surrounded by other civilizations. It was eventually conquered in the 11th century, but for a time it represented a kind of Buddhist sanctuary in Central Asia. These identifications remain speculative. The geographical descriptions in the Kalachakra texts are not precise enough to pinpoint a specific location, and they may have been deliberately vague or symbolic from the beginning. It's possible that the legend of Shambhala synthesized elements from multiple real places, combined with spiritual ideals and prophetic visions to create a composite that was never meant to be mapped in a literal sense. What makes Shambhala particularly interesting in our exploration of lost civilizations is precisely this ambiguity about its nature. It challenges our assumption that a lost civilization must be a physical place that can be excavated and studied. Shambhala suggests that some important human ideas about ideal societies, preserved wisdom, and spiritual refuge may be better understood as aspirational visions rather than historical realities. The legend serves important psychological and cultural functions. For Tibetan Buddhists facing persecution or exile, Shambhala represents the indestructibility of the Dharma. The teaching will survive even if monasteries are destroyed and teachers are killed. For spiritual seekers more broadly, it represents the possibility of enlightenment and the existence of wisdom beyond what is immediately visible in the mundane world. For those concerned about the direction of modern civilization, it offers hope that somewhere somehow better ways of living are being preserved. In this sense, Shambhala is less a place to be found than an ideal to be realized. The journey to Shambhala becomes a metaphor for spiritual development. The seeker must overcome obstacles, purify their mind, and develop wisdom and compassion. The kingdom itself represents the goal of this journey, a state of being where wisdom, compassion, and skillful action are fully integrated. This doesn't mean that all Tibetan Buddhists view Shambhala as purely symbolic. Many maintain that it exists as a physical place, even if it's currently hidden or inaccessible. The tradition allows for both interpretations to coexist, recognizing that different practitioners may relate to the teaching in different ways depending on their understanding and needs. The story of Shambhala reminds us that not all lost civilizations are the same. Some, like Helike or Akrotiri, were real places that can be excavated and studied. Others, like Atlantis, may be based on historical events, but have been so transformed by retelling that separating fact from fiction is nearly impossible. And still others, like Shambhala, may be primarily spiritual or philosophical constructs that serve purposes beyond historical documentation. This diversity of types challenges us to think more carefully about what we mean when we speak of lost civilizations. Are we looking for physical ruins or for wisdom and knowledge that has been forgotten? Are we searching for evidence of the past or for inspiration for the future? Are we trying to prove that certain stories are literally true, or are we exploring the deeper meanings these stories hold for human culture and aspiration? Shambhala, in its mystery and multiplicity of meanings, invites us to hold these questions lightly, to recognize that some of the most important truths may not be the kind that can be dug up or mapped, but rather the kind that must be cultivated within. From the spiritual heights of Shambhala, we return now to the physical world, and to a question that underlies many of these stories. What actually happened at the end of the last ice age? And could real catastrophes from that time have given rise to legends of lost civilizations? Doggerland, Atlantis of the North Sea. Having explored legends and disputed sites, we turn now to a lost land that requires no speculation. A place that was undeniably real, extensively inhabited, and completely submerged within human memory. If you could travel back 20,000 years and stand where the North Sea is today, you wouldn't be underwater. You'd be standing on solid ground, a vast landscape of rolling plains, river valleys, and marshlands stretching from what is now Britain to the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. This was Doggerland, a land bridge that connected the British Isles to continental Europe, and it was home to human communities for thousands of years before the sea claimed it. The existence of Doggerland wasn't always known to modern science. For centuries, fishermen working the North Sea occasionally pulled up strange objects in their nets stone tools, fragments of bone pieces of worked antler. These finds were curiosities difficult to explain. Why would human artifacts be lying on the seafloor, mixed with the bones of land animals, like deer aurochs and even mammoths? The answer began to emerge in the 19th century as geologists developed a better understanding of ice ages and sea level changes. They realized that during glacial periods, when vast amounts of water were locked up in ice sheets, sea levels had been dramatically lower than today. Areas that are now shallow seas had once been dry land. The North Sea, relatively shallow, with an average depth of only about 90 meters, would have been almost entirely above water during the last glacial maximum. The name Doggerland comes from Doggerbank, a large sandbank in the North Sea that remains relatively shallow even today in some places only 15 to 30 meters below the surface. This bank has long been known to fishermen who called it the Dogger after the Dutch fishing boats, or doggers that worked the area. It was here that many of the mysterious artifacts were recovered. One discovery in particular captured scientific attention. In 1931, the fishing trawler Kalinda was working near Doggerbank when its nets brought up a lump of peat, compressed plant material from an ancient marsh. Embedded in this peat was a piece of deer antler, and protruding from the antler was a barbed point made of bone. This was clearly a harpoon or spear point, crafted by human hands and used to hunt the deer. When the artifact was examined and dated, it proved to be approximately 11,500 years old, from the Mesolithic period when Britain was still connected to Europe. This find provided tangible proof that humans had lived on what was now the seafloor. But it would be many decades before technology allowed researchers to understand the full extent and nature of Doggerland. The breakthrough came in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, when archaeologists realized they could use data collected for other purposes to map the ancient landscape. Oil and gas companies had conducted extensive seismic surveys of the North Sea floor, using sound waves to map the layers of sediment and rock beneath the seabed. These surveys were designed to locate oil and gas deposits, but they also revealed the buried topography of Doggerland. Researchers at the University of Birmingham, led by archaeologist Vince Gaffney, obtained access to this seismic data and used it to create detailed maps of the landscape as it existed before the sea covered it. What emerged was a revelation, not a flat, featureless plain, but a complex and varied environment that would have been highly attractive to human settlement. The maps showed major river systems draining from the high ground that would become Britain and flowing eastward across Doggerland before turning north. These rivers created fertile valleys and floodplains. There were hills and ridges that would have provided good vantage points for hunting. There were lakes and marshlands rich in fish, waterfowl, and edible plants. The coastline, when the sea finally began to encroach, would have offered access to marine resources. This was not marginal land. During the Mesolithic period, when Doggerland was at its greatest extent, it would have been one of the most productive environments in northern Europe. The climate was gradually warming after the Ice Age, and the landscape supported large populations of game animals. For hunter-gatherer communities, this would have been prime territory. Archaeological evidence suggests that Doggerland was indeed well populated. In addition to the artifacts recovered by fishing vessels, systematic surveys have identified numerous sites along what would have been the rivers and coastlines of Doggerland. These sites show evidence of repeated occupation over thousands of years. The people of Doggerland were skilled hunters and fishers using sophisticated stone and bone tools. They would have moved seasonally, following game herds and taking advantage of different resources as they became available throughout the year. But Doggerland's days were numbered. As the great ice sheets covering Scandinavia and northern Britain began to melt, sea levels started to rise. This process was gradual, occurring over thousands of years, but it was relentless. The lowest lying areas of Doggerland would have been the first to flood, creating marshes and lagoons. Rivers would have widened, and the coastline would have steadily advanced inland. For the people living there, this change would have been noticeable within a single lifetime. Hunting grounds would become marshland. Settlements would need to be relocated to higher ground. The land bridge connecting Britain to the continent would have gradually narrowed, eventually becoming a chain of islands before disappearing entirely. Then around 8,200 years ago, Catastrophe struck. A massive underwater landslide occurred off the coast of Norway, an event known as the Storegga Slide. Approximately 3,500 cubic kilometers of sediment collapsed and slid down the continental slope into the deep ocean. This sudden displacement of water generated a tsunami that swept across the North Sea. The evidence for this tsunami can be found in sediment layers along the coast of Scotland, Norway, and the Netherlands. In some areas, the wave reached heights of 20 meters or more. For the remaining communities on what was left of Doggerland by this time, probably reduced to a series of low islands and coastal settlements, the tsunami would have been devastating. Archaeological evidence suggests that human activity in the region declined sharply after this event. Over the following centuries, the continued rise in sea level completed the submersion of Doggerland. By about 6,500 years ago, Britain had become fully separated from continental Europe. The land that had supported human communities for thousands of years was gone, preserved only in the sediments of the North Sea floor. The story of Doggerland is significant for several reasons. First, it demonstrates that lost lands are not merely the stuff of legend, they are geological and historical realities. Large areas of land that were once inhabited have indeed been submerged by rising seas, and this has happened within the time frame of human occupation. Second, Doggerland shows us how much of human history has been lost beneath the waves. The thousands of years during which people lived, worked, and died on Doggerland left almost no trace in the historical record. If not for the accidental recovery of artifacts by fishermen and the later application of seismic survey technology, we might never have known this land existed. How many other chapters of human history lie similarly hidden beneath the world's shallow seas? Third, the submersion of Doggerland provides a concrete example of how climate change and rising sea levels can fundamentally alter human geography. The people of Doggerland didn't have the option of building seawalls or relocating to higher ground indefinitely. Eventually, their entire world was claimed by the sea. This serves as a sobering reminder that the landscapes we take for granted are not permanent, and that human societies have faced and will face again the challenge of adapting to environmental changes beyond their control. Finally, Doggerland raises questions about cultural memory. Did the descendants of Doggerland's inhabitants preserve any memory of the lost land? By the time Britain became an island, several thousand years had passed since Doggerland was at its greatest extent. Oral traditions can preserve information across many generations, but can they maintain specific geographical knowledge across millennia? We don't know. But it's intriguing to consider whether some of the flood myths and legends of lost lands that appear in European folklore might contain distant echoes of Doggerland's submersion. The investigation of Doggerland continues. Researchers are using increasingly sophisticated techniques to map the ancient landscape and identify specific sites for potential excavation. Underwater archaeology in the North Sea is challenging. The water is cold. Visibility is often poor, and the sites are deep enough to require technical diving or robotic vehicles. But the potential rewards are significant. Every artifact recovered, every site mapped adds to our understanding of how our ancestors lived during a crucial period of human history. Doggerland stands as proof that lost lands are real, that significant portions of human history have been erased by rising seas, and that the boundary between land and ocean is far more fluid than we typically imagine. It's a reminder that the Earth is dynamic, that climates change, and that the world our ancestors knew was in many ways quite different from our own. From the drowned plains of the North Sea, we move now to another region, where rising seas claimed vast territories, the shallow waters of Southeast Asia, where an even larger landmass disappeared beneath the waves. Sundaland, the lost continent of Southeast Asia. Doggerland was not alone. Across the world, in the warm waters between mainland Asia and Australia, an even larger landmass disappeared beneath the rising seas, a tropical counterpart to Europe's drowned plains. Today, when we look at a map of Southeast Asia, we see a region of islands: Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, separated by relatively shallow seas. But this fragmented geography is recent in geological terms. 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, the map looked entirely different. What are now separate islands were connected by a vast expanse of land that geographers call Sundaland, or the Sunda Shelf. The scale of Sundaland was immense. At its greatest extent, it covered approximately 1.8 million square kilometers, an area larger than modern India. This landmass connected what are now the islands of Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and Bali to the Malay Peninsula and mainland Southeast Asia. The South China Sea, the Java Sea, and much of the Gulf of Thailand were dry land crossed by major river systems that drained the surrounding highlands. Unlike Doggerland, which was a temperate landscape emerging from Ice Age conditions, Sundaland was tropical throughout its existence. It would have been covered with rainforests, monsoon forests, and mangrove swamps along its extensive coastlines. The rivers that crossed it would have been major waterways comparable to the great rivers of Asia today. The climate would have been warm and humid with seasonal monsoons bringing heavy rains. This environment would have been extraordinarily rich in resources. Tropical forests provide abundant plant foods, fruits, nuts, tubers, and edible leaves. The rivers and coasts would have teemed with fish, shellfish, and other aquatic resources. Game animals would have included various species of deer, wild pigs, primates, and in some areas elephants and rhinoceros. For human populations, Sundaland would have been a highly productive and attractive place to live. Archaeological evidence for human occupation of Sundaland is limited by the same factor that affects Doggerland. Most of the sites are now underwater. However, evidence from the surviving highlands and islands suggests that the region was indeed well populated during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene periods. Stone tool assemblages from this era have been found across the region, indicating the presence of hunter-gatherer communities with sophisticated technologies. More intriguingly, genetic evidence suggests that Sundaland may have played a crucial role in human history. DNA studies of modern populations across Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and even as far as Madagascar show genetic signatures that point to ancient populations in the Sundaland region. These studies suggest that Sundaland was not just inhabited, but may have been a significant center of human population and cultural development. Dr. Stephen Oppenheimer, a British geneticist and anthropologist, has proposed that Sundaland was a refuge area during the last ice age, a place where human populations could thrive, while other regions were less hospitable. From this refuge, he argues people eventually spread outward as conditions improved, carrying their genes, languages, and cultural practices to new territories. This would help explain certain patterns in the distribution of languages and genetic markers across Asia and the Pacific. The linguistic evidence is particularly interesting. The Austronesian language family, which includes languages spoken from Madagascar to Easter Island, appears to have originated somewhere in Southeast Asia. Some linguists have suggested that the homeland of this language family might have been in areas that are now submerged parts of ancient Sundaland. If so, the flooding of Sundaland would have been a major driver of human migration and cultural dispersal. The submersion of Sundaland was a gradual process that unfolded over thousands of years. As the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose, the lowest lying areas would have flooded first. River valleys would have become estuaries, then bays, then open sea. Coastal settlements would have needed to relocate repeatedly as the shoreline advanced inland. Islands would have formed as higher ground became separated from the mainland. The process wasn't uniform or steady. Sea level rise occurred in pulses with periods of rapid increase, alternating with periods of relative stability. There were also regional variations depending on local geography and tectonic activity. But the overall trend was inexorable. Between about 20,000 and 6,000 years ago, sea levels rose approximately 120 meters, and Sundaland was progressively drowned. For the people living through this process, the changes would have been dramatic. A person born in a coastal village might see that village become an island by the time they were elderly. Traditional hunting grounds would become marshland, then lagoons, then open water. The great rivers that had defined the geography of Sundaland would have widened into straits, separating islands. Communities would have been forced to adapt, migrate, or perish. This raises a fascinating question. Do the flood myths and legends common in Southeast Asian cultures preserve memories of Sundaland's submersion? Many cultures in the region have stories about great floods, lost lands, and ancestors who fled rising waters. The Orang Asli people of Malaysia, various indigenous groups in Indonesia, and cultures across the Pacific all have such traditions. Oppenheimer and others have suggested that these stories might represent cultural memories passed down through countless generations. Oral histories of the actual flooding of Sundaland. This is a controversial idea. Most scholars are skeptical that oral traditions can preserve specific information across such vast spans of time. The flooding of Sundaland occurred over a period of more than 10,000 years, with the most dramatic changes happening between 14,000 and 7,000 years ago. Can cultural memory really extend that far back? The answer isn't clear. We know that oral traditions can preserve information for many generations. Aboriginal Australian traditions, for instance, appear to contain references to events from more than 7,000 years ago. But the reliability and specificity of such ancient memories remain debated. The flood stories in Southeast Asia might preserve genuine memories of Sundaland's submersion, or they might simply reflect the universal human experience of floods and the tendency of coastal peoples to tell stories about the sea's power. What we can say with certainty is that the submersion of Sundaland would have had profound effects on human populations in the region. It would have forced large-scale migrations, disrupted established patterns of life, and required people to adapt to rapidly changing environments. These pressures might have driven technological and cultural innovations, new forms of watercraft, new subsistence strategies, new social organizations. The challenge for archaeologists is that most of the direct evidence for life on Sundaland now lies beneath 40 to 60 meters of water, covered by thousands of years of marine sediment. Underwater archaeology in these waters is difficult. The seas are often murky, with strong currents and limited visibility. The sediment cover is thick, making it hard to locate sites, and the region is vast, searching for specific archaeological sites in an area of 8 million square kilometers is like looking for needles in a very large haystack. Despite these challenges, some underwater investigations have been conducted. Surveys off the coast of Malaysia and Indonesia have identified what might be ancient river channels and coastal features. In a few cases, stone tools and other artifacts have been recovered from the seafloor. But systematic underwater archaeology in the region is still in its early stages, limited by funding, technology, and the sheer scale of the task. The story of Sundaland parallels that of Doggerland in many ways, but it also differs in important respects. Sundaland was larger, more tropical, and potentially more densely populated. Its submersion may have had greater impacts on human cultural development, driving migrations that spread languages and genes across vast regions. And while Doggerland's flooding is relatively well documented through European archaeology, Sundaland's story is still being pieced together from fragmentary evidence. Both cases demonstrate that lost lands are not mythical. They are geological realities that have shaped human history in profound ways. The end of the last ice age wasn't just a change in climate. It was a fundamental reorganization of geography. Millions of square kilometers of land that had been inhabited for thousands of years were claimed by the sea. The human communities living on these lands were forced to adapt, migrate, or perish. The cultures that survived carried with them memories, technologies, and traditions shaped by their experiences. This perspective changes how we think about human history. We tend to imagine the past as occurring in the same geographical framework as the present, the same continents, the same islands, the same coastlines. But the geography of the past was often radically different. Major centers of human population and cultural development may have existed in places that are now underwater. Important chapters of our collective story may be hidden beneath the waves, preserved in sediments that we have only begun to explore. Sundaland reminds us that climate change and sea level rise are not abstract future threats. They are forces that have repeatedly reshaped human civilization. Our ancestors faced these challenges before, and their responses migration, adaptation, innovation shaped the world we inherited. As we face the prospect of rising seas in our own time, the story of Sundaland offers both a warning and a testament to human resilience. From the drowned forests of Southeast Asia, we turn now to a question that underlies all these stories. What caused the dramatic climate changes at the end of the Ice Age? And could sudden catastrophes have accelerated the process? Younger Dryas Catastrophe, Global Extinction Event. We've seen how rising seas gradually claimed vast territories over thousands of years. But what if catastrophe could strike more, suddenly not over millennia, but within a single human lifetime? Around 12,800 years ago, Earth was in the midst of a warming trend. The great ice sheets that had covered much of North America and Europe were melting. Temperatures had been rising for several thousand years, and the planet seemed to be transitioning smoothly from the Ice Age into a warmer interglacial period. Human populations were expanding, adapting to new environments, developing more sophisticated tools and social structures. Then, quite suddenly, everything changed. Within a matter of decades, perhaps, as few as 10 years, global temperatures plummeted. The warming trend reversed and much of the northern hemisphere returned to near glacial conditions. This cold period would last for approximately 1,200 years before temperatures finally began to rise again. Scientists call this event the Younger Dryas, named after an Arctic alpine flower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen appears in sediment layers from this period, indicating the return of cold-adapted vegetation. The Younger Dryas is one of the most dramatic climate events in recent Earth history, and its cause has been debated for decades. The traditional explanation involves ocean currents and fresh water. As the great ice sheets melted, enormous quantities of fresh water flowed into the oceans. According to this theory, a massive release of meltwater from glacial Lake Agassiz, a huge lake that formed from melting ice in North America, poured into the North Atlantic. This influx of fresh water disrupted the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the system of ocean currents that includes the Gulf Stream. This current system works like a conveyor belt, bringing warm water north from the tropics and returning cold water south at depth. The warm water releases heat into the atmosphere, moderating temperatures in Europe and eastern North America. But the system depends on differences in water density. Salty water is denser than fresh water and sinks more readily. If you add massive amounts of fresh water to the North Atlantic, it can disrupt this sinking process, effectively shutting down the conveyor belt. Without the warm water flowing north, temperatures in the northern hemisphere would drop dramatically. This explanation is supported by considerable evidence and remains the mainstream scientific view. However, in 2007, a team of researchers led by nuclear scientist Richard Firestone proposed a more controversial hypothesis. They suggested that the younger Dryas might have been triggered not by melting ice but by an extraterrestrial impact, a comet or asteroid striking Earth. The evidence they presented was intriguing. In sediment layers dated to approximately 12,800 years ago, they found unusual materials across a wide geographic area from North America to Europe to the Middle East. These materials included microscopic spherules of melted rock nanodiamonds that form under extreme pressure and temperature, high concentrations of iridium and platinum elements, more common in asteroids than in Earth's crust, and a layer of black carbon consistent with widespread wildfires. According to the impact hypothesis, a comet or asteroid, or perhaps multiple fragments of a larger object, struck the North American ice sheet and possibly other locations. The impacts would have instantly vaporized massive amounts of ice, sending water vapor and debris into the atmosphere. The heat would have ignited wildfires across the continent. The debris in the atmosphere would have blocked sunlight, creating a nuclear winter effect that plunged temperatures downward. The melting ice would have flooded low-lying areas and disrupted ocean currents, prolonging the cooling. This hypothesis generated considerable controversy. Some researchers found the evidence compelling and began looking for additional support. Others criticized the methodology, questioned whether the materials identified were truly unusual, and argued that the geographic distribution of evidence was inconsistent with a single impact event. The debate continues, with new studies regularly published, supporting or challenging various aspects of the impact hypothesis. What's not debated is the profound effect the younger Dryas had on life in the northern hemisphere. The cooling was severe. Temperatures in some regions dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. Forests retreated, grasslands expanded, and ice sheets that had been melting began to advance again. For human populations and animal species adapted to warming conditions, this reversal was catastrophic. In North America, the younger Dryas coincides with the extinction of most of the continent's megafauna. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, American lions, short-faced bears, and many other large mammals disappeared. Some species went extinct globally, while others survived only in isolated refugia or in other parts of the world. The exact cause of these extinctions remains debated: climate change, human hunting disease, or some combination of factors. But the timing suggests the younger Dryas played a significant role. The younger Dryas also coincides with major changes in human culture. The Clovis culture, which had been widespread across North America and is characterized by distinctive stone tools, disappears from the archaeological record at this time. This doesn't necessarily mean the people themselves disappeared. They may have adapted and developed new cultural practices, but it represents a significant discontinuity in the archaeological record. In the Middle East, the younger Dryas interrupted what had been a promising development toward agriculture. The Natufian culture, which had begun to settle in permanent villages and intensively harvest wild grains, faced severe challenges as the climate cooled and dried. Some researchers believe this stress may have actually accelerated the development of true agriculture, as people were forced to find new ways to ensure food security. The human cost of the younger Dryas is difficult to quantify. We don't have population figures for this period, and much of the archaeological evidence has been lost or remains undiscovered. But it's clear that human communities across the affected regions faced severe challenges. Food resources would have become scarce as plant and animal populations declined. Competition for remaining resources would have intensified. Some communities likely perished while others migrated to more favorable areas or adapted their subsistence strategies. This brings us to a speculative but intriguing question. If the younger Dryas could devastate hunter-gatherer societies, what would it have done to more complex civilizations, if any existed? Some researchers have suggested that if there were advanced societies during the late Pleistocene societies that haven't been recognized by mainstream archaeology, the younger Dryas could have destroyed them, leaving little trace. This idea remains highly speculative. We have no clear evidence of advanced civilizations existing before the younger Dryas. The archaeological record shows hunter-gatherer societies with increasingly sophisticated tools and social organization, but not cities, agriculture, or the other markers we associate with civilization. However, the proponents of this idea point out that the archaeological record from this period is incomplete, and that catastrophic events could have erased evidence of earlier achievements. Whether or not any advanced societies existed to be destroyed, the younger Dryas demonstrates that Earth's climate system can change with frightening rapidity. The transition from warming to cooling appears to have occurred within a decade or two, faster than a single human generation. This challenges the assumption that climate change is always gradual, giving societies time to adapt. Sometimes it seems the Earth's systems can flip from one state to another with little warning. The end of the younger Dryas was equally abrupt. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures began to rise again, and this time the warming was rapid and sustained. Within a few decades, the climate had shifted to conditions similar to those of today. The ice sheets resumed their retreat, sea levels continued to rise, and human societies entered the Holocene epoch, the current geological period in which all of recorded human history has occurred. This rapid warming at the end of the younger Dryas may have been as disruptive as the initial cooling. Ecosystems that had adapted to cold conditions now had to adapt to warmth. Human societies had to adjust once again to changing resources and environments. But this time, the changes led to what we call the Neolithic Revolution, the development of agriculture, the rise of settled communities, and eventually, the emergence of the first civilizations. The younger Dryas reminds us that we live on a dynamic planet, subject to forces that can overwhelm human societies regardless of their level of development. It shows us that catastrophic climate change is not just a future threat, but a recurring feature of Earth's history. And it raises the sobering possibility that we may be living in a period of unusual stability, a calm interval between storms that could return with little warning. The debate over what caused the younger Dryas continues. New evidence is regularly discovered, new analyses are conducted, and our understanding evolves. Whether it was triggered by meltwater and an impact or some combination of factors, the event itself is undeniable. For more than 1,000 years, the Earth experienced a dramatic return to ice age conditions with profound consequences for life across the northern hemisphere. As we face the prospect of human-caused climate change in our own time, the younger Dryas offers both warning and perspective. It warns us that Earth's climate can change rapidly and dramatically. It shows us that such changes can have catastrophic effects on ecosystems and societies. But it also demonstrates that life is resilient, that human societies can survive even severe climate disruptions, and that periods of crisis can sometimes lead to innovation and adaptation. From this ancient catastrophe, we turn now to a site that challenges our understanding of what Stone Age peoples were capable of achieving. A place that suggests sophisticated societies existed far earlier than we once believed possible. Göbekli Tepe, the temple that rewrote history. The younger Dryas showed us that catastrophe can erase civilizations. But in southeastern Turkey, a discovery has revealed that even before that catastrophe, humans were capable of achievements that challenge everything we thought we knew about our ancestors. In 1963, an archaeological survey team working in the Germush Mountains of southeastern Turkey noted a peculiar hill called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill in Turkish. The surface was littered with broken limestone fragments, and the team recorded it as a possible Byzantine cemetery before moving on. For 3 decades, the site remained undisturbed, just another unremarkable mound in a landscape dotted with ancient tells. Then in 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt visited the site. Schmidt had worked extensively in the region and had developed an eye for recognizing significant features. When he examined the limestone fragments on the surface, he realized they weren't natural. They showed signs of human working. More intriguingly, he noticed the hill's shape. It was too regular, too symmetrical to be entirely natural. Schmidt suspected that beneath the surface lay something significant. He had no idea he was standing on top of one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Excavations began in 1995, and what emerged from the earth was astonishing. Göbekli Tepe is a complex of massive stone circles, each consisting of dozens of T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in rings. The pillars are enormous. Some stand more than 5 meters tall and weigh up to 10 tons. They are precisely carved and decorated with elaborate reliefs depicting animals, foxes, lions, bulls, snakes, scorpions, vultures, and various birds. Some pillars feature abstract symbols whose meanings remain mysterious crescents, H-shapes, and other geometric forms. The site consists of multiple circular structures, each apparently built, used for a time, and then deliberately buried before a new circle was constructed on top. The largest circles measure up to 20 meters in diameter. At the center of each circle stand 2 especially large pillars, often more elaborately decorated than the others. The arrangement suggests these central pillars held special significance, though their exact meaning remains debated. What makes Göbekli Tepe revolutionary is its age. Radiocarbon dating and other methods have established that the site was constructed around 9,500 BCE, approximately 11,500 years ago. This makes it older than Stonehenge by about 6,000 years, and older than the Egyptian pyramids by roughly 7,000 years. It predates pottery, metallurgy, writing, and the wheel. It was built at the very beginning of the Neolithic period, during the transition from the Paleolithic. But here's what truly challenges our understanding. Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers. The people who constructed this monument had not yet developed agriculture. They had not domesticated plants or animals, except possibly dogs. They lived by hunting wild game and gathering wild plants. According to traditional archaeological theory, such societies shouldn't have been capable of creating monumental architecture. The conventional narrative of human development goes like this. First, people developed agriculture, which allowed them to settle in permanent villages. Settled life led to population growth and food surpluses. These surpluses freed some people from food production, allowing specialization of labor. This specialization eventually led to complex societies with the organization and resources needed to build monuments. Religion and organized ritual were thought to emerge from this process of social complexity. Göbekli Tepe turns this narrative on its head. Here we have monumental architecture requiring planning organization and the coordinated labor of hundreds of people built by mobile hunter-gatherers before agriculture existed. The implications are profound. It suggests that complex social organization and religious expression don't require agriculture and settled life. Instead, it raises the possibility that religion and ritual gathering might have preceded and perhaps even motivated the development of agriculture. Schmidt himself proposed this interpretation. He suggested that Göbekli Tepe was a ritual center, a place where different hunter-gatherer groups gathered periodically for ceremonies and feasts. The need to support these gatherings to feed the hundreds of people who assembled there might have encouraged the intensification of food production, eventually leading to the domestication of plants and animals. In this view, the temple came before the village religion, before agriculture. The logistics of building Göbekli Tepe are staggering. The limestone pillars were quarried from bedrock on the hill itself. Archaeologists have found the quarries and can see where pillars were cut free using stone tools no metal was available. Each pillar would have required dozens of workers to move it, even over short distances. Erecting them would have demanded sophisticated knowledge of leverage, probably using wooden scaffolding and ramps. The carving of the reliefs would have been equally labor-intensive. The animal figures are rendered with remarkable skill and attention to detail. Some show anatomical features that indicate close observation. The artist knew their subjects intimately. The abstract symbols are precisely executed, suggesting they had specific meanings, perhaps representing concepts or narratives we can no longer interpret. All of this required organization. Someone had to plan the structures, direct the quarrying and transport of stones, coordinate the labor of carving and erection, and presumably provide food and water for the workers. This implies social hierarchies, leadership, and the ability to mobilize labor on a scale previously thought impossible for hunter-gatherer societies. Yet there's no evidence of permanent settlement at Göbekli Tepe itself. No houses, no domestic debris, no signs that people live there year-round. It appears to have been purely a ritual center, a place people came to for specific purposes, and then left. This makes it even more remarkable. The effort invested in creating and maintaining this site was purely for religious or social purposes, not for practical survival needs. The animal carvings offer tantalizing clues about the belief system of Göbekli Tepe's builders. Many of the animals depicted lions, leopards, wild boars were dangerous predators or aggressive prey. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of a worldview focused on the wild, untamed nature that hunter-gatherers both depended on and feared. The prominence of vultures and other scavengers might relate to beliefs about death and the disposal of the dead. Some pillars appear to represent human figures in a stylized way, with arms carved along the sides and hands meeting at the front as if the pillar itself is a body. If so, these could represent ancestors, deities, or mythological beings. The central pillars in each circle, often the largest and most elaborate, might represent particularly important figures in the belief system. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of Göbekli Tepe is what happened to it. Around 8000 BCE, after approximately 1,500 years of use, the site was deliberately buried. The stone circles weren't destroyed or abandoned. They were carefully filled in with debris and soil, preserving them almost perfectly. Why would people invest so much effort in burying their sacred site? Various theories have been proposed. Perhaps the belief system changed, and the old monuments were no longer appropriate. Perhaps burying them was itself a ritual act, a way of closing one chapter and beginning another. Perhaps environmental changes or social upheaval made the site untenable. We don't know. But the deliberate burial is why Göbekli Tepe survived so well protected from weathering and human interference for more than 10,000 years. Excavation of Göbekli Tepe is far from complete. Ground-penetrating radar and geomagnetic surveys have revealed at least 16 additional stone circles still buried beneath the surface. Only a small fraction of the site has been excavated, perhaps 5%. Each new season of excavation brings new discoveries and new questions. The full extent and complexity of Göbekli Tepe won't be known for decades, perhaps centuries. The discovery has forced archaeologists to reconsider their assumptions about the capabilities of Stone Age peoples. If hunter-gatherers could build Göbekli Tepe, what else might they have achieved that we haven't yet discovered? How many other sites from this period remain unrecognized, dismissed as natural hills or medieval ruins, as Göbekli Tepe itself was for 30 years? The site also raises questions about the development of agriculture. The region around Göbekli Tepe is where some of the earliest domesticated grains have been found. Is this a coincidence, or did the gatherings at Göbekli Tepe somehow contribute to the process of domestication? Did the need to feed large gatherings encourage people to cultivate wild grains more intensively? Did the concentration of people facilitate the exchange of knowledge about plants and their properties? Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that we've consistently underestimated our ancestors. The people who built this site had the same cognitive abilities. We have the same capacity for abstract thought, symbolic expression, and complex social organization. They lacked our accumulated knowledge and technology, but they were not primitive in their thinking or capabilities. They could plan, organize, and execute projects of remarkable ambition and sophistication. This realization has implications for how we think about lost civilizations. If hunter-gatherers, 11th of 500 years ago, could build Göbekli Tepe, what might other societies have achieved in the thousands of years before recorded history? How much of human achievement has been lost to time, buried under sediment, submerged beneath rising seas, or simply erased by the passage of millennia? Göbekli Tepe stands as a monument, not just to the religious beliefs of its builders, but to human potential itself. It reminds us that civilization is not a recent invention, that our ancestors were capable of greatness long before cities and writing emerged, and that much of our past remains unknown, waiting to be discovered beneath the earth. From this temple that rewrote our understanding of the Stone Age, we turn to another enigmatic site in the Pacific, a place where massive stone structures raise questions about ancient engineering and the societies that created them. Madol, Venice of the Pacific. Göbekli Tepe showed us that monumental architecture existed far earlier than we imagined. But halfway across the world, on a remote island in the Pacific, another enigmatic site demonstrates that impressive engineering could flourish in the most isolated places. Off the eastern shore of Pohnpei, one of the Caroline Islands in Micronesia, lies a sprawl of artificial islands, unlike anything else in the Pacific. Madol, the name, means spaces between. In the local language, consists of nearly 100 artificial islets built on a coral reef lagoon. These islets are connected by a network of canals, creating what has been called the Venice of the Pacific. But unlike Venice, which was built with brick and wood, Madol was constructed entirely from massive basalt stones stacked in a distinctive log cabin style to form walls, platforms, temples, and tombs. The scale of Madol is impressive. The complex covers approximately 75 hectares, nearly 200 acres of reef and shallow water. The walls of some structures rise more than 8 meters high. The total volume of stone used in construction has been estimated at approximately 250,000 metric tons. Individual stones range from small blocks that could be lifted by 1 or 2 people to massive prismatic columns weighing as much as 50 tons. The site served as the ceremonial and political center of the Sodalur dynasty, which ruled Pohnpei from approximately the 13th to the 17th century. The various islets had different functions. Some were residential areas for the ruling elite. Others contained temples and ritual spaces. Still others served as burial sites for deceased rulers. The largest and most impressive structure, Nanduwas, appears to have been the royal mortuary where the bodies of Sodalur kings were interred. The construction of Madol represents a remarkable engineering achievement, but it also presents a puzzle that has fascinated archaeologists and engineers for decades. How did the builders transport and position these massive stones? The basalt used in construction doesn't occur naturally on Pohnpei's reef. The nearest source is on the main island several kilometers away. The stones had to be quarried from the volcanic rock transported across water, and then precisely positioned to create stable structures. The builders had no metal tools, they worked with stone and shell implements. They had no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals, and no sophisticated lifting equipment. Yet somehow they moved hundreds of thousands of tons of stone and built a complex that has stood for centuries. Local tradition offers an explanation that, while not scientific, reflects the awe the achievement inspired. According to legend, the stones were flown through the air by magic, guided into place by the twin sorcerers Olasipa and Olasopa, who founded the Saudeleur dynasty. The stones, it was said, moved at the command of these powerful magicians, settling into their positions without human effort. Archaeologists and engineers have proposed more prosaic explanations. The most widely accepted theory is that the stones were transported by raft. Basalt is denser than water and would normally sink, but if stones were lashed to logs or bamboo, they could be floated. The tides and currents in the lagoon could have been used to help move the rafts. Once at the construction site, the stones could have been maneuvered into position using levers, rollers, and inclined planes techniques that require ingenuity and coordination, but no advanced technology. However, no direct evidence of this method has been found. No ancient rafts, no remnants of rope or lashing. No clear indication of how the lifting was accomplished. The proposed method is plausible, but it remains theoretical. We can demonstrate that it could have been done this way, but we can't prove that it was. What we do know is that the construction of Nan Madol required substantial organization and labor. Estimates suggest that building the complex would have required thousands of workers over many generations. These workers had to be fed, housed, and coordinated. The Saudeleur rulers must have commanded considerable authority and resources to mobilize and sustain such an effort. The architectural style of Nan Madol is distinctive. The walls are built using a technique sometimes called stacked cribbing. Long basalt columns are laid horizontally alternating direction, with each course like a log cabin. This creates a stable structure that can flex slightly during earthquakes, an important consideration in this seismically active region. The spaces between the outer walls were often filled with coral rubble, creating a solid mass. Some structures feature more sophisticated elements. Nan Duva's The Royal Mortuary has a complex internal structure with chambers, passages, and what appears to be a central vault. The precision with which some stones are fitted suggests careful planning and skilled craftsmanship. While Nan Madol doesn't display the fine stonework of, say, Inca architecture, it demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. The Saudeleur dynasty that built Nan Madol ruled Pohnpei for several centuries, but their reign came to an end around 1628. According to tradition, the Saudeleur were overthrown by a warrior named Isokalakel, who came from Kosrae, another island in the Caroline chain. Isokalakal established a new dynasty, the Nanamwarki, which ruled Pohnpei, using a different system more decentralized with power distributed among multiple chiefs, rather than concentrated in a single ruler. After the fall of the Saudeleur, Nan Madol was largely abandoned. The new rulers chose not to maintain the complex, and the tropical environment began to reclaim it. Mangrove trees grew through the walls. Coral colonized the submerged portions. The canals filled with sediment. By the time European explorers arrived in the 19th century, Nan Madol was already a ruin, its history preserved only in oral tradition. The reasons for Nan Madol's abandonment remain somewhat unclear. The traditional account emphasizes the military conquest by Isokalakel, but other factors may have contributed. Maintaining such a large complex would have required continuous effort and resources. If the political or economic situation changed, if trade networks were disrupted, if population declined, or if the authority of the Saudeleur weakened, it might have become impossible to sustain the site. Some researchers have suggested environmental factors. Pompeii is subject to typhoons, which could have damaged structures and disrupted the food supply. The concentration of population at Nan Madol might have strained local resources, requiring food to be imported from other parts of the island. If this supply system broke down, the site would have become untenable. Today, Nan Madol is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized for its cultural and historical significance. But it's also listed as a site in danger. The structures are slowly deteriorating due to erosion, storm damage, and the growth of vegetation. The mangrove roots that penetrate the walls are gradually prying stones apart. Rising sea levels, due to climate change, threaten to accelerate the deterioration. Conservation efforts are underway, but they face significant challenges. The site's remote funding is limited, and the scale of the complex makes comprehensive preservation difficult. Nan Madol stands as a testament to what human societies can achieve even in isolated, resource-limited environments. Pompeii is a small island, far from any continent, with a limited population and no access to metal or advanced tools. Yet the people who live there created one of the most impressive architectural complexes in the Pacific, a site that continues to inspire wonder and raise questions centuries after its abandonment. The site also reminds us that geographical isolation doesn't prevent cultural achievement. Throughout the Pacific Islands, societies developed sophisticated navigation techniques, complex social structures, and impressive material cultures. Nan Madol is perhaps the most dramatic example, but it's part of a broader pattern of human ingenuity and adaptation. The mysteries that remain, exactly how the stones were moved, why the site was abandoned, what rituals were performed there, add to Nan Madol's fascination. But even without answers to every question, the site tells us something important: that human beings, given sufficient motivation and organization, can accomplish remarkable feats with relatively simple technology. The limitations we perceive are often limitations of imagination rather than capability. As we've journeyed through lost lands and ancient sites, from the depths of the ocean to remote islands and hidden valleys, we've seen how natural catastrophes, rising seas, and the passage of time have erased much of our collective past. But we've also seen how archaeology, geology, and new technologies are helping us recover these lost chapters piece by piece. From Nan Madol's stone islets, we turn finally to consider what all these stories of sunken lands, ancient temples, and vanished civilizations tell us about human history and our relationship with the planet we inhabit. Evidence from the seabed, modern technology searching for the past. Throughout our journey, we've encountered the fundamental challenge facing anyone who searches for lost civilizations. Most of the evidence lies beneath the ocean, hidden under meters of water and sediment. But in recent decades, technology has begun to change this equation dramatically. For most of human history, the ocean floor was as inaccessible as the surface of another planet. Divers could reach shallow depths, but anything beyond about 30 meters was dangerous and brief. The deep ocean, where much of the evidence from rising sea levels would lie, was completely beyond reach. This began to change in the 20th century, and the pace of change has accelerated remarkably in recent years. We now possess tools that would have seemed like science fiction just a generation ago, and these tools are revolutionizing underwater archaeology. The foundation of modern underwater exploration is sonar sound navigation and ranging. The basic principle is simple: send out sound waves and measure how long they take to bounce back. But the sophistication of modern sonar systems is extraordinary. Multi-beam sonar, developed initially for submarine navigation and later adapted for scientific research, can map the seafloor with resolution measured in centimeters. These systems send out multiple beams of sound, simultaneously creating detailed, three-dimensional maps of underwater terrain. What makes this technology particularly valuable for archaeology is its ability to detect subtle variations in seafloor topography. Natural formations have characteristic patterns, gradual slopes, irregular surfaces, features that follow geological processes. Human-made structures, by contrast, often show straight lines, right angles, and symmetrical arrangements. Multi-beam sonar can reveal these patterns, identifying potential archaeological sites that would be invisible to divers or traditional survey methods. The application of this technology has already produced intriguing results. In 2000, advanced digital communications engineer Paulina Zalitsky was conducting sonar surveys off the coast of Cuba when her equipment detected unusual formations at a depth of approximately 700 meters. The sonar images showed what appeared to be symmetrical structures, shapes that resembled pyramids, rectangular blocks arranged in patterns, and what might be roads or pathways connecting them. The discovery generated considerable excitement and controversy. At 700 meters depth, these structures would be far below the level of any known sea level changes during human history. If they were artificial, they would have to be extraordinarily ancient built when the area was above water, which would place them well before any known civilization in the region. Skeptics pointed out that sonar can sometimes create artifacts or misrepresent natural formations. The depth makes direct investigation extremely difficult and expensive, requiring specialized equipment and extensive funding. More than 2 decades later, the Cuban structures remain unverified. The images are tantalizing but inconclusive, and the technical and financial challenges of investigating them at such depth have prevented definitive answers. This case illustrates both the promise and the limitations of sonar technology. It can reveal possibilities, but confirmation requires more direct investigation. That's where remotely operated vehicles and autonomous underwater vehicles come in. ROVs are tethered robots, controlled from the surface, equipped with cameras, lights, and various sensors. They can descend to depths that would be fatal to human divers and remain there for extended periods. AUVs are untethered robots that follow pre-programmed routes, conducting surveys independently before returning to the surface. These vehicles have transformed underwater archaeology. They can capture high-resolution video and still images, collect samples, and even perform limited excavation work. Their ability to work at great depths and in conditions too dangerous for humans has opened up entirely new areas of investigation. One notable success came in 2015 when an ROV explored the Antikythera shipwreck off the coast of Greece. This wreck, first discovered by sponge divers in 1900, had already yielded remarkable artifacts, including the Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek analog computer used for astronomical calculations dating to the 1st century BCE. The 2015 ROV expedition discovered additional artifacts and provided detailed documentation of the wreck site, advancing our understanding of ancient maritime trade and technology. The technology continues to evolve. Modern ROVs can be equipped with manipulator arms, capable of delicate work with sonar systems for navigation in zero visibility, and with sensors that can analyze materials without disturbing them. Some systems use photogrammetry, taking thousands of photographs from different angles to create precise three-dimensional models of underwater sites. Meanwhile, satellite technology is contributing to underwater archaeology in unexpected ways. Satellites can't see through water, but they can detect subtle variations in sea surface temperature and color that might indicate underwater features. Changes in water depth affect how waves move and how sunlight penetrates, creating patterns visible from space. Archaeologist Sarah Parcak has pioneered the use of satellite imagery for archaeological discovery. In 2011, using infrared satellite images, she identified 17 potential pyramids more than 1,000 tombs, and over 3,000 ancient settlements in Egypt, most of them previously unknown. While her work has focused primarily on land-based sites, the techniques she's developed are being adapted for coastal and shallow water archaeology. Satellite imagery can reveal ancient coastlines, river channels, and harbors that are now submerged. By combining satellite data with bathymetric surveys and historical records, researchers can identify areas where ancient settlements are likely to be found. This allows them to focus expensive underwater investigations on the most promising locations rather than searching blindly. Another emerging technology involves analyzing ancient DNA from marine sediments. As organisms die and decay, they leave traces of their DNA in the surrounding sediment. By extracting and analyzing this environmental DNA, scientists can determine what species lived in an area at different times in the past. This can help identify when coastlines were above water, what kind of vegetation grew there, and even potentially detect evidence of human presence through the DNA of domesticated plants and animals. The combination of these technologies is creating a new paradigm in underwater archaeology. Researchers can now survey vast areas, efficiently identify promising sites, investigate them remotely, and extract information without disturbing fragile remains. Projects that would have been impossible or prohibitively expensive a generation ago are now feasible. Consider the investigation of Doggerland, which we explored earlier. The mapping of this drowned landscape was made possible by accessing seismic survey data originally collected by oil and gas companies. This data, processed with modern software, revealed the ancient topography in extraordinary detail. Now researchers are using this information to target specific areas for investigation, with ROVs and sediment coring gradually building a picture of life in Doggerland before it was submerged. Similar projects are underway around the world. Off the coast of Israel, underwater archaeologists have mapped ancient harbors and settlements submerged by rising sea levels. In the Black Sea, researchers have discovered remarkably well-preserved shipwrecks in the anoxic waters of the deep basin. Off the coast of Alexandria, Egypt, entire neighborhoods of the ancient city have been mapped and documented underwater. The technology is also being applied to more speculative searches. Expeditions have investigated the structures off Bimini, the formations at Yonaguni, and various other sites where unusual underwater features have been reported. In many cases, these investigations have concluded that the features are natural, but the process of investigation itself advances our understanding of marine geology and underwater survey techniques. The pace of technological advancement shows no sign of slowing. Artificial intelligence is being applied to analyze sonar data, identifying patterns that might indicate human activity. Improved battery technology is extending the range and duration of AUV missions. New imaging techniques are providing better resolution and penetration through sediment. Virtual reality systems are allowing researchers to visit underwater sites without leaving their laboratories. Yet technology alone cannot answer all our questions. The ocean is vast, covering more than 70% of Earth's surface, and the areas where ancient settlements are most likely to be found are often the most challenging to investigate. Coastal waters tend to be murky with strong currents and heavy sedimentation. The most interesting sites are often in areas that are difficult to access or politically sensitive. There's also the question of interpretation. Technology can show us what's there, but determining whether a feature is natural or artificial, and if artificial, what it represents, and when it was created, still requires human expertise and judgment. The debates over sites like Yonaguni and Bimini demonstrate that even with good data, reasonable people can reach different conclusions. Despite these challenges, we're living in what might be called the golden age of underwater archaeological discovery. More has been learned about submerged sites in the past 30 years than in all previous history. The rate of discovery is accelerating as technology improves, and more resources are devoted to underwater investigation. Sites that were completely unknown a generation ago are now being systematically explored and documented. This technological revolution is changing how we think about lost civilizations. The ocean is no longer an impenetrable barrier hiding the past. It's becoming a vast archaeological archive, gradually yielding its secrets to patient investigation. We're learning that the story of human civilization is more complex, more ancient, and more geographically diverse than we once believed. In the coming decades, we can expect more discoveries that challenge our understanding of the past. Settlements from the end of the Ice Age will be found and explored. Ancient trade routes will be mapped. Shipwrecks will reveal details of maritime technology and commerce. And perhaps among all these discoveries, we'll find evidence that sheds new light on the legends of lost civilizations that have fascinated humanity for millennia. The technology exists. The ocean is gradually giving up its secrets. And with each discovery, we come closer to understanding the full scope of human history, not just the chapters preserved on land, but also those written on coastlines that are now beneath the waves. From the cutting-edge technology revealing our past, we turn finally to reflect on what all these stories of lost lands, ancient catastrophes, and rediscovered civilizations tell us about who we are and where we've come from. Flood stories, global memory or coincidence? As we've explored lost lands and ancient catastrophes, one pattern has emerged repeatedly: stories of great floods that destroyed previous worlds. These stories appear not in one or two cultures, but in more than 200 traditions across every inhabited continent. This raises a profound question: are we looking at independent invention or at cultural memory of real events? The most familiar flood story in Western culture comes from the Hebrew Bible, the account of Noah, who built an ark to save his family and representatives of all animal species from a deluge that covered the earth. But this story recorded in Genesis is far from unique. In fact, it may not even be the oldest version. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in ancient Mesopotamia around 2100 BCE, contains a flood narrative that predates the biblical account by centuries. In this version, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by the god Ea that the other gods plan to destroy humanity with a flood. Ea instructs Utnapishtim to build a great boat, seal it with pitch, and bring aboard his family, craftsmen, and animals. The flood comes, lasting 6 days and 7 nights, destroying all other life. When the waters recede, Utnapishtim's boat comes to rest on a mountain, and he releases birds to find dry land. First a dove, then a swallow, finally a raven that doesn't return. The parallels with the Noah story are striking: the divine, warning the boat construction, the destruction of humanity, the mountain landing the birds sent out to find land. Scholars generally agree that these stories share a common origin, likely in the flood-prone region of Mesopotamia, where both cultures developed. But flood stories extend far beyond the Middle East. In Greek mythology, Zeus decides to destroy humanity because of their wickedness. Only Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha are warned by the Titan Prometheus. They build a chest, survive the 9-day flood, and land on Mount Parnassus. When the waters recede, they repopulate the earth by throwing stones that transform into people. In Hindu tradition, the Matsya Purana tells of Manu, the first man who saves a small fish from being eaten. The fish grows enormous and warns Manu that a great flood will destroy all life. The fish instructs Manu to build a boat and gather seeds of all plants and pairs of all animals. When the flood comes, the fish, revealed to be an avatar of the god Vishnu, tows Manu's boat to safety on a mountain peak. Chinese mythology includes the story of Gun Yu, which describes a great flood that lasted for generations. The hero Gun attempts to stop the flood by stealing divine soil that can grow infinitely but he fails and is executed. His son Yu succeeds by dredging channels to drain the flood waters, eventually becoming emperor and founding the Xia dynasty. Indigenous peoples of North America have numerous flood traditions. The Hopi speak of the destruction of previous worlds by water. The Ojibwe tell of Nanabojo, who survives a great flood by floating on a log with various animals, then recreates the world using mud brought up from beneath the waters. The Haida of the Pacific Northwest describe how Raven warned people of a coming flood, and those who listened survived by tying their canoes to mountain peaks. In South America, the Muisca people of Colombia tell of Bochica, a hero who appeared after a great flood and taught the survivors agriculture and crafts. The Mapuche of Chile describe how the ocean rose up and covered the land, with only the highest mountain peaks remaining above water. Even in Australia, Aboriginal traditions include flood stories. The Gunditjmara people speak of a time when the sea rose and flooded the land, forcing people to move to higher ground. Various Aboriginal groups have stories about the creation of coastal features through flooding events. This global distribution of flood narratives has fascinated scholars for centuries. The traditional explanation has been that floods are common natural disasters, and that human societies living near rivers and coasts would naturally develop stories about catastrophic flooding. In this view, the similarities between flood myths are coincidental, the result of different cultures independently creating similar narratives to explain similar experiences. This explanation has merit. Floods are indeed common and devastating. River floods, storm surges, tsunamis, and dam failures have destroyed communities throughout history. For pre-literate societies, such disasters would be remembered and retold, often acquiring mythological elements in the process. The tendency to frame disasters as divine punishment or cosmic events is also common across cultures. However, some researchers have noted that the similarities between flood myths go beyond what might be expected from independent invention. Many stories share specific details. A single righteous person or family warned in advance the construction of a boat, the saving of animals, the landing on a mountain, the use of birds to find land. These narrative elements appear in cultures that had no known contact with each other. This has led to an alternative hypothesis that at least some flood myths might preserve cultural memories of actual historical events, specifically the dramatic rise in sea levels that occurred at the end of the last ice age. Between approximately 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, as the great ice sheets melted, global sea levels rose by about 120 meters. This wasn't a uniform gradual process. It occurred in pulses with periods of rapid rise, alternating with periods of relative stability. Some of these pulses were dramatic. The meltwater pulse 1A, which occurred around 14,600 years ago, raised sea levels by approximately 16 to 25 meters in less than 500 years. Meltwater pulse 1B around 11,500 years ago caused another rapid rise. For coastal communities, these changes would have been catastrophic. A rise of even a few meters over a few generations would force the abandonment of settlements, fishing grounds, and hunting territories. Low-lying coastal plains, Tibet, often the most productive and heavily populated areas, would be progressively inundated. Islands would shrink or disappear entirely. River valleys would become estuaries, then bays, then open ocean. The human impact would have been profound. Archaeological evidence shows that coastal areas were indeed heavily populated during the late Pleistocene. These populations would have been displaced by rising seas, forced to migrate inland or to higher ground. The social, economic, and psychological trauma of losing ancestral lands to the advancing ocean would have been immense. Could memories of these events have been preserved in oral tradition? For thousands of years, most scholars have been skeptical. Oral traditions are known to change over time, with details being added, removed, or altered with each retelling. The idea that specific information about events 10,000 or more years ago could be preserved seems implausible. However, recent research has challenged this skepticism. Studies of Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have found that some stories appear to preserve accurate information about events from more than 7,000 years ago. Geological investigations have confirmed that certain coastal features described in Aboriginal stories were indeed created by sea level rise during the early Holocene. If oral tradition can preserve information for 7,000 years, might it preserve memories from even earlier? The question remains open. Some flood myths might indeed preserve distant memories of post-glacial sea level rise. Others might describe more recent local floods. Still others might be entirely mythological, created to explain the presence of marine fossils on mountaintops, or to provide moral lessons about divine power and human behavior. Likely, the global corpus of flood myths includes all these elements mixed together in ways that are now difficult to untangle. What we can say is that the end of the Ice Age was a time of dramatic environmental change that profoundly affected human societies. Rising seas displaced populations, destroyed settlements, and forced adaptation to new conditions. These experiences would have been remembered, retold, and eventually mythologized. The stories that survive today may contain fragments of these ancient memories, mixed with later additions and interpretations. The flood myths also remind us of something important, that human beings have faced catastrophic environmental change before and have survived. Our ancestors lived through the end of the Ice Age, through the drowning of Doggerland and Sundaland, through the younger Dryas and its aftermath. They adapted, migrated, and rebuilt. The stories they told about these experiences became part of their cultural heritage, passed down through countless generations. In this sense, flood myths are not just about the past, they're about human resilience and the continuity of cultural memory. They testify to our ancestors' ability to survive catastrophe and to preserve knowledge across vast spans of time. And they remind us that the world we inhabit is not static, that coastlines shift, climates change, and human societies must continually adapt to new conditions. Whether the flood myths preserve specific memories of post-glacial sea level rise or represent more general responses to the universal experience of flooding, they connect us to our deep past. They show us that people thousands of years ago faced challenges similar to those we face today: environmental change, displacement, the need to adapt to new realities. And they demonstrate that human culture, transmitted through story and tradition, can preserve important knowledge across time spans that seem almost incomprehensible. As we conclude our journey through lost civilizations, sunken lands, and ancient catastrophes, the flood myths serve as a fitting final chapter. They encapsulate many of the themes we've explored: the power of natural forces to reshape human geography, the fragility of civilizations in the face of environmental change, the persistence of cultural memory, and the ongoing challenge of distinguishing historical fact from mythological embellishment. They remind us that the boundary between history and legend is often unclear, and that the stories our ancestors told might contain more truth than we once believed. Over the past 3 hours, we've journeyed through some of humanity's most enduring mysteries and most profound discoveries. We began with the legends: Plato's Atlantis, the mystical Lemuria, Churchward's Mu, and the hidden realm of Shambhala, examining how these stories emerged and what they reveal about our collective imagination. We explored real lost lands that science has confirmed: Doggerland, the drowned plain that once connected Britain to Europe, and Sundaland, the vast tropical landscape that disappeared beneath Southeast Asian waters. We investigated controversial sites like the Bimini Road and Yonaguni, where the boundary between natural formation and human construction remains debated. We stood in awe before Göbekli Tepe, the temple complex that rewrote our understanding of Stone Age capabilities and explored Madol, the stone city built on artificial islands in the Pacific. We examined the catastrophic Younger Dryas event and its devastating impact on ancient peoples. And we considered how modern technology, sonar underwater, robot satellite imagery is revolutionizing our ability to explore the ocean floor and recover lost chapters of human history. What emerges from this exploration is a picture far more complex than simple myth or straightforward history. Some lost civilizations exist only in legend, created to serve philosophical purposes or to explain natural phenomena. Others, like Doggerland and Sundaland, were undeniably real vast inhabited landscapes claimed by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. Still others occupy an uncertain middle ground, where tantalizing evidence exists, but definitive proof remains elusive. The flood myths that appear in hundreds of cultures worldwide might preserve distant memories of post-glacial sea level rise, or they might simply reflect the universal human experience of living with water's destructive power. We cannot always be certain, but what we can say with confidence is that the ocean holds secrets we're only beginning to uncover. Millions of square kilometers of land that were once inhabited now lie beneath the waves. Settlements, hunting grounds, sacred sites, and the daily lives of countless generations have been preserved in marine sediments, waiting for the technology and resources to reveal them. Each year brings new discoveries, ancient harbors mapped off Mediterranean coasts, Stone Age tools recovered from the North Sea floor DNA, extracted from seafloor sediments revealing what species lived where and when. The pace of discovery is accelerating, and our understanding of human history is expanding accordingly. This matters because it changes how we think about our past. For too long, we've imagined human history as occurring in the same geographical framework we know today, the same coastlines, the same islands, the same distribution of land and sea. But the world our ancestors inhabited was often radically different. Major centers of population and cultural development existed in places that are now underwater. Important innovations might have occurred in regions we can no longer access. The story of human civilization is larger, older, and more geographically diverse than we once believed. It also reminds us of our vulnerability. The civilizations we've explored, whether legendary or real, were shaped and sometimes destroyed by forces beyond human control. Rising seas, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and climate shifts have repeatedly transformed the human landscape. Our ancestors faced these challenges with far fewer resources than we possess, yet they survived, adapted, and rebuilt. Their resilience is part of our inheritance. But so is the knowledge that the world is not static, that coastlines shift, that what seems permanent can be swept away by forces we cannot prevent. There's something deeply human about our fascination with lost civilizations. Perhaps it's the appeal of mystery, the idea that important knowledge might be hidden, waiting to be rediscovered. Perhaps it's a kind of humility, a recognition that we don't know everything about our past, that our ancestors might have achieved things we haven't yet recognized. Or perhaps it's simply the power of a good story, the way tales of Atlantis and Shambhala capture our imagination and make us wonder what might be possible. Whatever draws us to these stories, the search for lost civilizations has value beyond satisfying curiosity. It pushes us to develop new technologies, to ask better questions, to look more carefully at evidence we might otherwise dismiss. It reminds us that history is not a closed book, but an ongoing investigation with new chapters being written as new discoveries are made. And it connects us to the long chain of human experience, to the countless generations who lived, loved, built, and dreamed on landscapes that no longer exist above the waves. The ocean keeps its secrets, reluctantly revealing them, only to patient, persistent inquiry. But gradually, piece by piece, we're recovering what was lost. Not just physical artifacts and architectural remains, but knowledge about how our ancestors lived, what they valued, how they responded to catastrophe, and what they passed down through story and tradition. Each discovery adds to our understanding, and each understanding enriches our sense of who we are and where we've come from. As we close this exploration, the questions remain as compelling as ever. How much of our history lies beneath the waves? What civilizations thrived on lands that are now submerged? What knowledge was lost when those lands disappeared? And what might we yet discover as technology continues to advance and our ability to explore the ocean floor improves? These questions will occupy researchers for generations to come. The answers, when they emerge, will continue to reshape our understanding of human history. Thank you for joining this journey through lost lands and ancient mysteries, through scientific evidence and enduring legends. If you're still awake and found this exploration worthwhile, there are other stories waiting in the playlist. But for now, rest is what matters most. May your dreams be peaceful and may you wake refreshed. Good night.